All right. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I am so excited today. In fact, I would go so far as today to say that today feels almost like an early Christmas because I am joined by the one, the only Mr. Dhruv Bansal. In a world of great thinkers who have influenced me about Bitcoin, there is no one who has pushed my imagination farther than Dhruv. So to have you on the show today, man, what a real treat.
Thanks, Max. It's a pleasure to be here. And for my part too, I feel like I sometimes worry that I can only think while talking. And so I have to go recruit great friends that are wanting to have great conversations so that I can think about great things. And I definitely include you in that number. I feel like we often have great mind expanding conversations that don't get recorded. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of, put us on the record.
Yeah, man. No, likewise. Over the years, it's been a real treat to talk to you off the record. I don't know what's going to happen today. As you said, a lot of our conversations are random walks.
Hmm.
Today we have a slightly more structured conversation, only slightly. For those listening, don't worry. There will, I'm sure, be many detours which we're not counting on. But maybe to give everyone just a little bit of a signpost, there's three major topics that I'm personally excited about, and all of them actually you've inspired my thinking on quite a bit. They are Bitcoin is energy-backed money and sort of the fusion of the energy and Bitcoin markets, which her blockchain mind candy talk from 2018 first referenced, or for me at least, and we'll come back to that. The idea of how we can build truly decentralized infrastructure that meters potentially via the Lightning Network at the actual packet level, which is very interesting to me, and then digital and evolving autonomous life. So that's kind of where I'm hoping we go, and I'm sure we'll touch on a lot of other things. So sound good?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay, so let's start with the energy backed money piece. So for those of you who haven't seen, I've referenced this many times, but Drew's blockchain mind candy talk, I think, is still one of the deepest cuts, best kept secrets on the internet. Highly recommend you check that out. You proposed a number of different interesting ideas about Bitcoin, but the first one to me was the one that interested me the most, and that was thinking about, well, the way I would interpret it is Bitcoin is energy backed money, and you kind of made some very interesting concordances between the energy industry and Bitcoin as a potential off taker of that energy, and potentially one day an industry with which the energy industry would fuse. In that talk, you mentioned a number of interesting things. One is the idea of a Nakamoto ratio. And the idea of the Nakamoto ratio was a conjecture, as you put it, that perhaps at its more or less, stable point, or once it reaches somewhat of a stasis, that maybe Bitcoin's still growing relatively in the size of total world GDP, but that there's some percentage, give or take, of total world energy supply that is necessary to secure the money supply. Is that still a conjecture you agree with? How is your thinking around the Nakamoto point changed today?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think to give some increasingly more specific context to answer that question, that talk, it's a favorite of mine too, if I'm honest with myself, right? I feel like that was when I was really, really falling down the rabbit hole into Bitcoin around 2018 or so. I'd already started Unchained, but I thought Bitcoin was one set of things, and I was realizing the more I thought about it, man, it connected to all these other areas of life and inquiry that I'm super excited about and passionate about and maybe knowledgeable about. Maybe one of the first people who knows a lot about Bitcoin to start thinking about how does it interact with this part of established science and lore and speculation. So it was a really fun speculative talk for me. I sort of like pushed myself to say, well, what can I say about Bitcoin as it connects with everything from energy to the internet, which we'll probably talk about in the second part of this conversation, to space, which I wound up writing a whole series of articles about Bitcoin and space and how it evolves as humanity goes and settles the solar system and beyond. Um, we probably won't have too much time to get into that one today, which is probably good. I feel like I've said all I want to say on that topic
Yeah,
historically.
part two in the future. You never know.
Sure, we'll come back to aliens at one point. And then even deep connections between Bitcoin and physics, and I'm formerly a physicist, and um, it's just fun to find patterns and try to investigate why those patterns are similar and try to understand that. So it was a really fun talk for me because I really pushed myself to speculate really hard in a bunch of directions. Um, and I think happily, a lot of those speculations did turn into future work. So I almost feel I've been mining that talk personally for other articles and pieces of content over the intervening years. Excuse me. Um, but in particular, the energy stuff, yeah, that was one of the more reasonable aspects, I think, of the talk, one of the least speculative areas. In fact, I started the talk kind of connecting Bitcoin to energy, because of course, Bitcoin is deeply connected to energy somehow, right? To electricity
Mhm.
specifically, the power that is being used by Bitcoin miners all the time, which may be a good thing, maybe a negative thing. Certainly in 2018 was more commonly viewed as an obviously negative thing. These days, I think that attitude is starting to thaw and soften, and people are starting to realize, who maybe aren't even, diehard Bitcoiners, that there's maybe something powerful and important about Bitcoin's energy usage, over and above the simple naked fact that it uses energy, right? Like we're sort of starting to contextualize that energy usage based on the value that Bitcoin creates. So I'm happy that in the intervening 6 years or 7 years, that the world has come a little closer to Bitcoin and to me and to my thoughts on it. But the ratio that you describe is like a pretty simple ratio to describe in theory, but it's hard to calculate precisely. But I think we have a rough estimate of it, right? The ratio is how much of the world's electricity is being used in Bitcoin mining,
Mhm.
compared to how much electricity is being produced globally, right?
Mhm.
And I argued that at least in 2018, it was something close to, let's say, 0.1% or 10 bips of world electricity production was being spent on Bitcoin mining on some level. And I think that ratio has probably grown. It's probably closer to 1% of the world's electricity right now is being spent on Bitcoin mining. The fact of the ratio is not itself a conjecture. There just is such a ratio. The
Right.
conjecture was more that a couple things, like number one, that ratio would increase over time. And I believe so, at least
So far, so good.
so far that's proven out to be correct. And that eventually it would stabilize. And I think that's the part of the conjecture that I personally am least sure of, but it's an interesting part of the conjecture to me. And the reason it boils down to is I sort of think of like local and global trends. That the local trend, both in space and time, is that there's a gap between what electricity costs to consume and what Bitcoin is worth on the open market, right? That if you have energy and you choose to sell that energy somehow downstream to consumers for general purposes, you're kind of getting an average general rate of, at that time, again, depends on where you live, something like 6 to 8 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a cursed unit, but that's okay. Um, whereas Bitcoin at the same time was producing, 3, 4 times that amount of revenue if you thought of taking that energy and cycling it through Bitcoin miners and then selling the Bitcoin and then comparing in dollar terms, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, there's a capex kind of component to that. You have to be able to have Bitcoin miners in the first place. But if you have energy, you also need equipment to sell that energy, right? You need to connect to downstream grids so you can actually transfer it. It's not like selling energy is itself free and doesn't require capex either. So point is, there's two things you could do with your energy. You could sell it on the broad market, or you could sell it into a specific market, and that there was a massive gap in the revenues that you would earn. Now,
Right.
obviously, the Bitcoin mining market at that time was much smaller. Today, it has grown a lot more. But the conjecture to me was that these don't seem like particularly different use cases for a person who has energy or a company that has energy, and that we
Right.
should expect to see a concordance of energy producers and Bitcoin miners as they sort of merge into the same industry, which is ultimately, it turns out these days, also merging perhaps with a certain degree of AI workloads. Essentially, like computing as a market becomes so energy intensive that it starts to be more closely coupled to energy production. So I feel like
Mhm.
that's like not that controversial of a thesis, and does seem to be happening broadly as computing develops across use cases. Um, the Nakamoto ratio, specifically being like how much of the electricity is used specifically for Bitcoin, um, ultimately closes when there is no such premium, right?
Right.
Like it doesn't, at once you can make about as much selling to the general market as you can selling to the Bitcoin network. There's no reason to keep growing that share, that ratio. It should sort of stabilize, right? And asymptotically, as it approaches that, there's less and less incentive to do selling to the more narrow and constrained market. Um, but right now, I believe, I don't know the exact figures today, but like there's still a gap, right? And there's a reason
Yep.
Bitcoin mining is profitable, especially over the long term as Bitcoin appreciates, right? There is some, there's a lot of volatility. So if you're a Bitcoin miner, the fact that Bitcoin may drop a lot in value or experience a halving definitely creates tension at a macro level on your installations. But if you can survive through a cycle, and you can think on a 4-year basis instead of a 1-year basis, Bitcoin mining can still be pretty profitable, far more profitable than just selling energy broadly to the market. And so, I think the part that I was right about in that conjecture is, yep, the ratio exists and continues to get higher as Bitcoin adoption and the value of Bitcoin increases. don't know if we'll see it freeze, right? I think to see it freeze, we'd sort of have to, or stabilize, we sort of have to see Bitcoin stabilize at some sort of
Right.
market cap, at some sort of broad, you know, base of money in the world. And I think we're still years to decades away from that. So more to be said there. I think these days I have a slightly different way that I would even talk about that. Like I
Okay.
didn't have the same, I didn't have this language as much back in 2018 when I was describing it, but I still was thinking about it in terms of an economic voluntary trade. These days, the way I like to talk about that same concept is, and this will ultimately connect to my language around markets when we talk about layer two and lightning, but
Yeah.
we really need to think of Bitcoin as markets, right? Where
Yes.
voluntary exchange is happening, and that's what's propelling the market forward. And in fact, I no longer like to engage in locutions such as Bitcoin miners create Bitcoin or mine Bitcoin. I don't
Mhm.
believe they mine Bitcoin any longer. I believe they mine blocks. And I believe they sell those blocks to the Bitcoin network in exchange for Bitcoin. And it seems like a
Right.
pedantic, nerdy, small difference, but actually I think really meaningfully changes the frame of what's happening and why it's important and what's good or bad about it. Like in particular, I think the notion that Bitcoin miners are wasting energy to produce Bitcoin when you could just produce Bitcoin more efficiently if that was your goal, it leads people to think that the whole community is just sick first, like we just like wasting energy, when you could imagine being more efficient about creating those Bitcoins. So if the point of Bitcoin mining is that it creates Bitcoins, it doesn't seem like a very efficient system, right? But if the point of mining is to create blocks, like provably spent computations, and then to exchange that for Bitcoin, now the size of the industry is really just a reflection on the value of Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin are
Exactly.
worth a lot of money or wealth or resources, no matter how you choose to measure it. If you choose to measure it in dollars, they're worth approximately $100,000 each. If you choose to measure it in computations or in energy, they're worth a
Yes.
lot there too. And that's why miners have to exchange so much energy and so much computation to obtain Bitcoin, right? They're not producing it, they're buying it, right? And I think this resolves a bunch of other weirdnesses when you think about it. Like, Satoshi was able to produce 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes on his laptop in 2009. Yet today we are worse at producing Bitcoin collectively because we're less efficient at it, even though the industry is, orders of magnitude larger. And that's a weird growth curve for an industry to experience, and it does seem perverse. It's much easier to explain if it's not being produced, if it's just merely being traded. And so I really
Yeah.
like that way of talking about it now.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I mean, you've kicked off so many different things. And obviously, I'm very much on the same page. I don't know if you know this, but I wrote most of a paper with Block and ARK Invest in 2021
Mhm,
called Bitcoin is Key to an Abundant Clean Energy Future, which made a number of arguments. One of which is that the system is, in fact, more efficient once you realize it's going to scale and you compare it to Visa, MasterCard, all the banks, maybe the US
mhm,
Navy, depending on how you're looking at that.
mhm,
But also that it's, incentivizing my other thing, I'm a sort of maximalist of, which is solar plus storage. And that's its own whole other rabbit hole. But I couldn't agree with you more on those points, but also the point that this is a market. It's a market for computation or a market potentially for jewels. To that point, I'm curious your take on this because I know you expressed some reticence to call Bitcoin energy money, and I know that term has gotten overused. And I generally agree with you. One term that I have really come to like, and I borrowed this from one of the companies I work with, Satoshi Energy, is energy backed money. And increasingly the way I thought about Bitcoin and what really sold me coming from the solar industry, originally into Bitcoin was, reading books like Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth from Buckminster Fuller and a bunch of other folks who talked about, look, there's only one currency of the known universe, which is joules or kilowatt hours, full stop. Whether that's but potentially you could even break it down further than the ATP, which we may do when we talk about metabolism and the Krebs cycle later. But some proxy on energy. And you could argue gold was a proxy energy because you could dig it up. Today's dollar, petrodollar backed by the Navy, and of course,
mhm.
oil in Saudi Arabia. Could you see a world eventually where Bitcoin functions as essentially a ledger of kilowatt hours or joules, and you're actually just paying joules for things?
I think we should be a little careful, right? Like I'm reminded of in the world of programming, you often like care a lot about small distinctions, like the
Yes.
TASVA versus ISA, right? Is a sort of
Mm,
distinction that matters a lot. Like, is it an instance of that thing, or is it merely connected to something, which is an instance of that thing? And
mm.
I think with Bitcoin, there's a certain element of that happening, where yeah, I think once I would have called it energy money, and that excited me, right? Like joules, and as a former physicist, the notion that Bitcoin is somehow just energy all along is very attractive. And but again, as I thought about it more, it's like no, it's not really, because if it were, we're sort of like why does it cost so much, right? And the answer is well, it costs so much because it's worth so much, right? So it really does feel like energy is being exchanged for Bitcoin again in that voluntary market process between miners and the Bitcoin network. And there, okay, so now can you say it's energy backed because there's a market that trades directly energy or computations? If we really want to be specific, we should say computations, right?
Hmm.
Um, that there's a market because of the existence of a market which trades computations or energy directly for Bitcoin, therefore it's an energy backed currency. That feels like a more reasonable statement, but I'm still
Right.
sort of left wanting with that, right? Like,
Hmm.
I think the best way to describe it would be that it's an energy adjacent money, that
Hmm.
it's the only money perhaps that you can directly trade, like for computations. That doesn't mean it is computations or that it's
Right.
backed by computations, but that it's very convenient to trade Bitcoin for computations. And I think the back reaction of the energy supply chain as it encounters and then comes to terms with and becomes disrupted and modified by Bitcoin mining as an activity is expected not because necessarily Bitcoin is made of energy or because Bitcoin is energy backed, but because of how adjacent Bitcoin is to energy, which is a separate marketplace. Energy can be bought
Hmm.
and sold for other things. It can be bought and sold for dollars. It can be that, but those markets are less efficient. They're more centralized. They're more prone to political manipulation. Bitcoin's market, that the rails that connect Bitcoin to energy exchange are much more open, decentralized, and difficult to control. In fact, the constraints on those are expressed largely in terms of the difficulty adjustment and Bitcoin's own release schedule.
Hmm.
Um, and the desire of Bitcoin miners to always, have relatively more hash than other miners, so they can continue to compete for the margins of Bitcoin that are being wagered as transaction fees and so on. So in this sense, like I'm not trying to diminish the impact that Bitcoin has on the energy industry, but I argue it's not because it's made of energy or energy backed so much as it is just incredibly convenient and unique in the way that it interacts with energy as a counter asset.
Yeah.
And that as Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is money, starts to connect to other kinds of markets in novel and interesting ways, we should further expect disruptions in those markets, right? That we're going to talk, for example, about how Bitcoin maybe disrupts the market for certainly payments in Lightning and Visa and so on, but maybe that connects to a market for moving data through the internet, through an internet.
Right.
And so now it's not that Bitcoin becomes internet backed money or Bitcoin is internet money or Bitcoin is information. I mean, it sort of is all those things in a loose, squinty sense. It's more
Right.
that because we built some unique ways of exchanging Bitcoin for things in this new category, that Bitcoin's qualities start to change and disrupt this new category, right? And it's
Right.
largely not so much because of I suppose Bitcoin itself as much as it is an interaction with Bitcoin, right? The opportunity to break down a lot of barriers that make markets inefficient or fraudulent, and then requiring inefficiencies to prevent and limit fraud, right? If we take that away and we just have a more open, programmatically executing market that just scales better and is easier to grow, well, then that itself becomes the disruptive change that we want to benefit from, right? And that's
Yeah.
definitely happening in energy, right? It's
Yeah.
absolutely happening in energy.
I guess I don't fully understand your distinction between adjacent and backed, because to me it's like
I don't think I understand it, to be
yeah,
to be fair. Yeah.
fair enough, fair enough. So we're still thinking this live, because to me what's so interesting about this is I think about whether it's you sort of energy backed or computation backed. That's like a super fair way of saying it as well. But the killer feature to me of that is it's this portal between this digital realm or mental realm where I'm thinking
Mhm.
of things, but it's still backed by some kind of real scarcity in the real world. And energy or computations, those are obviously scarce things today. Maybe in the future, there's other even better proxies on scarcity that one could come up with besides proof of work. But as far as I've seen, I don't think, and this is why proof of stake obviously is like a self-referential system that will one day collapse and it has to, versus something that is based on some fundamental scarcity in the real world. Energy is the best one that I've sort of come up with today, although computation, I think, is another way of saying that.
Mhm.
I think to me that's the key feature is just some way to tie into something that can't go infinite in quote unquote base reality, if that's what this is.
I think it's absolutely true, and I don't think there's any way to have built Bitcoin other than what we discovered, right? That's often the way I like to approach it. It wasn't invented, it was discovered.
Yeah.
And that aliens would have discovered the same kind of a market, right, that
Yep.
existed between
Maybe they have.
maybe they have, right? And so that part does feel very deep to me, and I absolutely agree. The backed part is maybe it's a semantics thing, right? Like for
Yeah.
example, if we suddenly found a way to access far more energy here on Earth, right,
Mhm.
that has no effect on the supply of Bitcoin.
Of
So
course.
it's not that the supply of Bitcoin is backed by energy. That's not quite what we mean when we say it's energy backed. I think we mean something like the release schedule of Bitcoin is
Yes.
in some sense like guarded or weighted against our overall energy, and that comes back to notions like the Nakamoto ratio of like how much of
Yes.
our energy are we choosing to spend on money supply creation versus protecting the money supply and so on. So again, in that sense, like the word backed just feels a little strong, right? Like if you were to say, our currency is backed by a supply of gold, right? Then presumably as that supply of gold changes and
Yeah.
increases or decreases, that has some effect on the market value or the supply of the currency that is backed by it. And that connection isn't quite there in Bitcoin.
Hmm.
Though there is, of course, an overall concept that as Bitcoin becomes more valuable, more energy is used or exchanged by miners in order to purchase it in its release schedule, as well as to purchase it in transaction fees from users. Um, it's a very interesting connection. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
So I certainly prefer people to understand that Bitcoin is connected to energy in a deep way that
Right.
isn't inherently evil because energy is being used to in Bitcoin's own functioning. So as soon as we can dismiss that like mistake, then and understand that there is a deep connection here, like I feel like that's the most important part. I don't need to quibble on the rest of it. Like,
Yep.
if Michael Saylor wants to say that it's energy hornets or whatever is
Yeah.
the
I,
excited thing about it, it's like, oh wait, cool. I'm about that excitement too. I'm excited about that too. But if we want to be more precise, then I struggle to say that's really backed by energy. It's merely just exchange for energy, and the way that exchange happens is itself revolutionary, new, and disruptive, and that's changing the world of energy.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. And maybe to your point, maybe the backing, like you said, is it's not the supply, and that is an important point, but maybe the security that
Hmm.
upholds the integrity of the ledger itself, both emission and future transactions.
Hmm.
One last point I wanted to touch on that, and then maybe we can jump into our next market. But the reason the Nakamoto consensus interested me so much is, I know at some point I came across some literature from the Gold Bugs or the Austrians, and there was research in their field of basically this open question of, is there a sort of a percentage of world GDP or energy production, however you want to say it, that is necessary to secure the monetary supply? And the reason when you said the Nakamoto consensus, it just like pinged a light bulb in me was, hey, maybe this is a question that we can empirically answer, that the gold bugs have been, trying to answer. But now, there's actual data. So that's what was getting me really excited about it.
I mean, it is interesting because when you bring energy into these discussions, you can start to really talk about optimization and get kind of hard edged about it, right? And bring out equations and all sorts of stuff. Like you can sort of ask, like, what is the optimal energy supply for Earth right now that we should have, right? Well, it's not infinity, right? Like it's not optimal to have vastly more energy than we're using because we struggle to store energy efficiently. We tend to be optimally provisioned in terms of both like how we choose to invest in energy infrastructure and so on. Like I'm not going to say that our energy mix is optimal by any means, right? But we think about optimization a lot when we think about funding energy infrastructure. And we try to compare the cost of obtaining energy in this way versus this other way. And we really try to calculate it out. I think what's so again disruptive about Bitcoin is that it changes that calculus, right? That
Yes.
energy overabundance and overproduction is actually potentially profitable because you always have a consumer for that extra energy that you didn't previously have. I think that's starting to change now with AI workloads to a degree, right? That like AI workloads are becoming another market for Bitcoin miners to sell their supply into. It's not the exact same supply, it's not the same ASICs, but there's a lot of adjacent capabilities that they have around just energy production, cooling, et cetera, et cetera. And it is interesting to see, like, is there a similar ratio, right? Like an optimal amount of energy that we spend on, I don't know, AI training collectively or on, you know, uh, if AI, I tend to think of today's evolution of AIs, despite the more heady conversations we might get into at the end of this conversation, but like, I tend to think of them as largely search algorithms, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, it's almost like asking, I have a web application called Humanity. Like, how much compute should I be spending on the search index that allows us to search what this humanity application is producing at all times? Well, I could sort of answer that question if this were a real web app. I could sort of look at search volume and search
Yeah.
complexity and what is my 99.9% latency figure. And I could sort of say, well, okay, my searches are too slow or inefficient or I'm too frequently getting no results. I need to spend more time building a richer index and so on, right? Versus deciding that I have a good enough index and I don't need to spend any more on it. I don't know. Maybe that's a dismissive opinion of AI so far, but it's clear that the search is useful enough and good enough that people want to spend more than we're currently spending, right, to produce it.
Totally, and it can change over time too, right? So that's
Hmm.
also interesting to see. Okay, so we're moving steadily towards the sort of AI crescendo, if you will. So going back to your 2018 blockchain mind candy talk, the next set of markets you talked about was Lightning networks with the specific purpose of creating mesh networks and the ability to, in real time, both deliver, meter, and charge for what I would call physical resources delivered digitally, things like bandwidth, storage, computation. And you argue that until we had a truly peer to peer network of these physical resources, those are kind of going to be the central choke points that end up killing things like Bitcoin, one day, maybe it's many decades in the future. Do you still agree with that? How has your thinking changed? Are we going to have Lightning networks inside of Lightning networks? And I know we'll also talk about some competitive networks that may be achieving similar things, but where is your head with that now?
Yeah, I think then again, a poverty of vocabulary in that era, right? Like I thought of Lightning as it was really the only layer two proposal I was super familiar with in 2018. And it wasn't, as I recall, I don't think it was even deployed yet, right? They were still waiting for, I think, the August hard fork that came that year to get segregated witness out there so we could,
Yep.
solve transaction malleability. There's all these sort of technical obstacles along the way. So it was a very early era. And now I can say many years later, well, the Lightning Network is not where I thought it would be today, like
Yep.
truthfully.
Yep.
Um, but partly I think that's also because what is there to buy with the Lightning Network? Like, as most Bitcoiners are using Bitcoin as a savings vehicle, right, to get ahead of inflation, to protect their wealth, they're not necessarily choosing to spend it. I think there are some places in the world where we have more day-to-day circular economy type activity in Bitcoin, and I think, but ultimately, I think Bitcoin as a medium of exchange starts to make sense when there's uniquely things that you can buy in Bitcoin that you can't buy with
Yes.
any other currency.
Yes. Agreed.
That's the reason you spend Bitcoin on it because it really is just the most convenient way to get that thing that you care about. Um, and so it's dubious to me that the things that we would choose to spend Bitcoin on are going to be coffees because we could always buy coffees with other things, or literally anything physical in the world probably could be settled with another currency, unless it's an illegal good, right? So potentially Lightning being used as a black market currency is potentially happening. I mean, it could be happening a lot right now, and we don't even know it.
Yeah.
Because Lightning is not necessarily a public network or a discoverable network. There can be very many private channels, and Lightning black markets are sort of being woven together right now, and we wouldn't necessarily know,
Yep.
which I think is a powerful um, uh, property for any layer two to be able to have, is to increase the privacy of what we can do on layer one. Yeah, so with all that said, these days I think I'm less about Lightning specifically, though I'm not like a Lightning Network hater or dismissive of it anyway. Ultimately, I think we're just so incredibly early in the story of Bitcoin that Lightning itself is still just very early, right? Like Bitcoin
Yeah.
adoption overall is just super early. And
Yeah. I
so
know.
these problems aren't as pernicious as they will be in coming years. And humans always tend to solve problems just when we need the solution, it emerges somehow. And so I think as people care more and have a larger need to spend Bitcoin transactionally, then yeah, the Lightning Network will start to grow a lot more. Um, I think that the central thing that I would now say differently and sort of frame the conversation differently now as compared to 6 years ago is I think a lot more in terms of markets today than I thought perhaps then. I think back then I was a little bit more like a lot of technologists who come into Bitcoin, blockchain, blah, blah, blah. I was thinking more about the code and the protocols and timescales of settlement, and how long does it take a packet to go around the earth, and questions of this nature. Whereas today, I'm a little bit more focused on order books and price discovery, and trade structures and things of this nature, right? Like, and to put it bluntly, like the Lightning Network is a second layer, non-blockchain payment channels network that's designed to allow us to quickly and efficiently and cheaply um, use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange to actually pay for things in the world with it. That's its stated purpose. Um, but I think a pattern, something I call the beautiful surprise these days, is that no matter what you think you're building, there's a beautiful surprise in there that you're actually building something
I
maybe
like that.
like else in addition, not instead of, but in addition. Like at layer one, for example, sorry, at what I call layer zero, actually these days, right? The exchange of Bitcoin for computations as part of the release schedule of Bitcoin. We think we're trying to build a money, right? But we wind up building a clock. Because in
Mm.
order to release our money on schedule, we need to be able to tell time, and we can't trust, people's wristwatches and CPU clocks. So we have to build a sort of distributed clock, and that's required to be able to have our auction for our money supply proceed. And just to get money into the hands of people so they can do anything with it at all, we needed to build a clock, which is an interesting statement.
Hmm.
And then similarly at layer one, which is the market for settling Bitcoin transactions, which exchanges block space for Bitcoin. Um, we think that we're building a payment settlement like auctioning system, right? Like things are in the mempool, they get lifted by miners into the blockchain, they're selling the block space for it. But at the same time, we also built a virtual machine that in order to understand what kinds of transactions can possibly be expressed by the system, what problems would owners of Bitcoin need to express, right? Indeed, even anticipating things as far forward as layer two and lightning networks and HTLCs and constructions like this, right? You sort of need to be able to say all those things at the level of the protocol itself. And so just to design the ability to send you a Bitcoin, I need to build a virtual machine, it turns out. There's some good copy of you that you can find that Satoshi sort of realizes at some point during his work that instead of having to build, umpteen different categories of transaction, he should just give you a virtual machine. And then you can declare that you can program the kind of transaction you want it to be. Yeah, of course, to a point, right? I think
Yeah.
when Bitcoin first came out,
Turing complete, right?
yeah, right. Well,
I
I
kid,
think
I kid.
ironically, when Bitcoin first came out, there was ways to make it Turing complete because of essentially mistakes or oversights or opcodes which were deemed a little too dangerous. So we've stripped all that out now as a community, and we're left with nonetheless a programmable kind of money, right? And so it's fun to me that at layer one you wind up having to litigate what yeah, you have to think about computability and Turing
Yeah.
machines and all sorts of things like that. You're just trying to move money around. But if you don't think about that, you get it wrong. So that's really cool. And at layer two, right, returning to Lightning, we think that we're building a second layer IOU based payment channel network, but we are actually building a kind of an internet, right? Because in order to make these payments between nodes at this new layer completely anonymous and private, in order to not have them be trackable, right? We use onion routing. So we use
Yep.
this complex onion routing scheme to be able to pass payment information node to node, peer to peer along the path of the payment through the network. This means that we need to think about how we route in the network, that we wind up solving a routing and networking problem just to solve the money passing around problem. And this problem doesn't exist at layer zero and layer one, right? Because when we use Bitcoin, we in some sense all want to be in the same place, right? There's only one blockchain and one mempool, and we don't have a concept of a payment path, right? Because all payments are just occurring on the blockchain directly. There isn't a network aspect to it beyond that. I mean, there is, of course, a peer-to-peer network behind Bitcoin that has a topology and has network paths and all these concepts, but that's not really what comes into play at that layer, right? Whereas at Lightning, that stuff is really front and center.
Yep.
And kind of connecting to it, I think a talk that I gave recently that you were curious about, like when I think about networks of keys, right?
Yeah.
Lightning really is a network of cryptographic connections between people, which I think is a pretty powerful construct. It's not something we really have in other places. Like we have things like Signal and other end-to-end encrypted messaging networks, but they're very much centrally coordinated. Um, I suppose we've had things like encrypted messaging and all sorts of other more decentralized solutions, but they never really scaled, right?
Right.
Like because they weren't really deeply connected to money. Like I think Lightning has a chance, or something like Lightning has a chance of being a really interesting, step in human connectivity because it is a cryptographically equipped peer-to-peer network that is not centrally managed, that is deeply connected to money, which means we can build incentives, which are really strong. And for example, a line I often like to trot out is despite being, not the first onion routed network, Lightning is probably the most successful onion routed network because you get paid to run Lightning nodes, whereas you don't
Versus
get paid.
Tor, which is what
Yeah,
most people would
exactly.
think.
You do not get paid to run Tor nodes, and so why are you taking all that risk? So very few people do it, and as a result, many Tor exit nodes are actually just run by intelligence agencies, and the network itself is its global anonymity guarantees are now compromised because of the lack of an ability to create economic incentives to drive providers to provide services like being a Tor node. Whereas in the world of Lightning, because it's an open marketplace where there's a protocol for trading that earns Bitcoin, I can plug into that protocol. I don't necessarily have to go find my customers. They're just sort of out there waiting for me, though that's not quite true in Lightning, right? Or at least it's less true in Lightning than it is at Bitcoin layer one, right? If I'm a miner, I don't do marketing. I don't go try to recruit customers to use my mining hash rate as preferred. It's just I get to see the entire order book of requests. I get to see every transaction that's in the mempool.
Yeah.
There's only one mempool, right? In the world of Lightning, to a degree, I have to go recruit my own customers because I have to go build payment channels with specific entities. And the market has a more spatially heterogeneous structure as a result, and that makes it more difficult to optimize. I think one of the big challenges for me is like what is the right way to get to the same point that we kind of already have at layer one out the box, which is there's a mempool, which is the entire order book that contains the demand for the network, and I know exactly how to make money. I just plug into that existing demand with my hash rate. In Lightning, we're not quite there. I can't just show up with some Bitcoin and park it in some channels and immediately start to make a ton of money because I'm addressing all the network demand that's out there. I have to go discover that demand. I have to
Right.
aggregate and learn and scrape ultimately, right? Like the Lightning Network. We don't think of it that way today because the network is so small that like there isn't, as far as I know, like ongoing massive common like economically incentivized scrapers out there, like learning the structure of the network so they can resell the most topologically efficient routes
I think
back
it's
into the
starting.
immediate marketplace.
I think it's very early, but yes, I agree. It's
It'll,
not mainstream yet.
the reason it's not mainstream right now is because there isn't tremendous competitive pressure, right? Because there isn't tremendous usage because Bitcoin is fucking early, right? So we
Yeah,
always just come back
exactly.
to that same.
We need use cases.
We're just so early, right?
Yeah.
But I'm excited for there to be use cases that are unique things that you can buy through Lightning, and I think that really starts to get into the next most interesting part of the speculation, which is. I should go ahead.
So I do want to jump into that. And I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
going to be an excellent segue. But before we do, I want to pause on this Lightning as Tor because this is
yeah.
something that I remember you chatting about. I think you and Ryan chatted a lot about a
Oh
couple
yeah.
of years back as well. Do you still believe that the Lightning Network is going to become the new Tor that eventually everyone uses for every packet, or let's say the vast majority of packets routed online?
I don't know, and it's because I don't know that the Lightning Network today cares about those problems. Number
Yeah,
one, and two, like it will depend a lot on how the topology of the network grows and how much it becomes more centralized, where there's only a few major hubs, versus more decentralized, where there's a lot of routing opportunities. Um, it, we have to make it profitable in the Lightning Network to create the connections that allow us to route the money at the level of payments. If that network becomes really rich and well connected, that's very efficient for me to make a payment to you over the Lightning Network, then we can start to solve the much harder problem of routing packets over that same topology, right?
right,
That like it's kind of like when the internet is early and the bandwidth and connectivity is rather limited, you simply can't have something like a YouTube, right? Like a high
right.
bandwidth application, like you're stuck on Usenet, right? So to a degree, I think we'll start to see some of the lower bandwidth, lower complexity distributed services start to spawn on Lightning, and they'll be at the fringes, right? They'll be like marketplaces for stuff that is forbidden. There'll be places that have forbidden speech. There'll be places that often have, I think, really ugly speech and ugly data that no one wants to admit is out there, but is already out there. And it'll be a great way for, those horrible people to monetize their activities. I sort of admit to that, but at the same time, it'll keep growing past that point, right? I think it'll grow to the point where IP starts to be threatened meaningfully because we'll enter a golden age of piracy where I think
I
we're
like
only
that.
convenient. Yeah, I like that too, dude. I live in Los Angeles, and a lot of my friends and family and colleagues out here are in the entertainment industry, and I walk around like waiting for IP to end. So
Yeah, me too.
um, it's a little stressful, maybe, but anyway. So I think outcomes like that will start to happen like gradually, and then the more capable the applications that we can host within this monetized per packet kind of network, um, the more new markets start to get disrupted, right? Like IP starts to get disrupted. I think eventually computer security starts to get meaningfully disrupted social media. Eventually, I think this connects back to AI and all these things, but it all comes back to like today, the Lightning Network is testing the hypothesis that we can motivate Bitcoin users to solve their own payments problem by building a network of payment channels that allows them to route those payments. Ultimately, those payments are just data of a certain specific kind. And now the network they would have built is an efficient, presumably network at routing data in an anonymous, monetized not per pack, but per payment kind of way.
Mhm.
Can that be extended to route at a more fine-grained level packets themselves? I think there would have to be, obviously some changes. Not every packet you would send through the Lightning Network necessarily needs to be its own Lightning payment. I think there are ways to collapse that and to sort of treat the Lightning layer as more of a streaming accounting layer for the actual packets that you're sending back and forth through it. It'll just be interesting to see that develop and evolve. Right now, the Lightning Network is largely in a source routed kind of modality in which, like, where the internet first began, right? There was a file on your computer like etc hosts, which still means something today to computer system administrators. But that file was basically a list of everybody who's on the internet
Nice.
and how to reach them. Like, what is their IP address? And at least at the level of IP, like not at the level of like, like internet gateways and BGP networks and stuff like that, but at a higher level of these IPs, you as a user of the internet had to have a list of where everybody else on the internet is, and that's how your computer went and found them, right? It had their address. Um, that then obviously didn't scale, right? My computer no longer has a list of every other computer on the internet. There's a discovery mechanism that has been established, DNS, and other schemes by which we can hierarchically look up the thing on the internet we're seeking to find and sort of get incrementally pointed closer and closer to it as our packets route through that network.
Yeah.
We have to get to that point with Lightning, right? But unlike with Lightning, what we don't want is we don't want a bunch of geographically like sort of monopolistic sub networks that together are glued into the internet, because that's what the internet really is, right? It's a bunch of autonomous systems that are largely independently controlled by a centralized provider of that system, like whoever's running your local area network in your city, let's say, or your neighborhood, and then connecting those autonomous systems together. That's the inter part of the internet, right?
Mhm.
But we don't want that for Lightning. We don't want that in this region of Los Angeles, there's one
Xfinity
major
controls my packet.
or controls my Lightning payments, right? Like that's a bad
Yeah.
outcome for us. And so, how can we create the same degree of coordination and performance, but ultimately driven by ultimately more open market incentives? That's a hard problem because
Yeah.
simple questions like, well, how can I get a list of everybody who's waiting to make a Lightning payment? There's no obvious answer to that, right? There isn't the equivalent of a mempool, which only works because it's so small, by the way, right? The size of people willing to make large Bitcoin payments is the cardinality of that set is just smaller than the cardinality of the number of people who want to make a smaller payment on a more efficient payments network. It gets to the point where you can't just go ask one computer for that whole list. There has to be a large set of computers maintaining that list. Well, which set of computers? How do I find that set of computers? Doesn't that just become this point of centralization for the entire network at that point?
Yeah.
So this notion of how do you scale an order book, right, past something like the mempool into a much larger regime of cardinality, that is like the hardest problem. I kind of refer to that increasingly as the hard problem of blockchains or of distributed markets or whatever you want to call this world, or even of Bitcoin, right? The hard problem of Bitcoin is how do we replicate the market-based dynamics that we have at simple layers like layer 0 and layer 1 for these higher layers that are inherently just larger in terms of the market activity that they want to coordinate.
Yeah.
Really hard.
Well, what you're describing, another topic, perhaps we'll have time to get into, but it reminds me a lot the early days of the sort of Usenet you're talking about with what's happening today in Nostr and
Yes.
web of trust that is emerging there. And I think web of trust could be an answer to a lot of the issues that you're referring to. But before we jump into that, I do want to make sure we touch and get to the metabolic pathways, because I know that's going to be our next exciting path. You keep saying, okay, look, Lightning Network is great. One day it could be this huge network for all payments. The problem is we don't have demand. We need services that you can only buy Bitcoin. And I could not agree with you more. I hate this. Oh man, like you just need to whip out your, Cash App to pay for your coffee. Like, no, like no one's going to do that. And if you do it, it's a very small segment of the community. It's never going to scale. So what are the things that we could actually buy only with Lightning? And, like you, the thing I've been thinking about a lot is what I call physical resources delivered digitally, bandwidth,
Mhm,
storage, and compute.
mhm.
I like to joke, at my fund HiveMind, I'm desperate to invest, and maybe we're too early, but in people that have like looked at all the shitcoin networks, like the Heliums and the Golems and the Filecoins, and just said, these are great ideas. Let's build these networks for these resources, but we don't need a stupid token. We can just do this with Bitcoin. So I think this is also going to go, potentially into the AI usage case, which, I think gets into some of your thinking around metabolic pathways you've called or metabolism. But as a sort of a transition point, what are some of your best guesses
Mhm.
at these kinds of resources or products or services that you think are good fits for the Lightning Network that could only be purchased with Lightning today?
Honestly, I think my top contender is content.
Okay.
Like if we like, there's a collection of tools that are like sort of coalescing, and no one has really put them all together in the killer app. Like no one has made the equivalent of Bitcoin D or Lightning D even. But it's like it's a mixture of Lightning for routing payments, pretty traditional file storage, systems for hosting huge amounts of data. Tools like Plex, right, which are sort of open source Netflix-like content browsers, and they're really interesting. Like there's fewer people doing it now, maybe than once in the past, but there used to be a time what I often refer to now as the silver age of piracy, which is approximately when I was in college, so late 90s, early 2000s. We had just sort of figured out peer-to-peer networks, right? Like, and they were, I think, truly an inspirational thing in that era. It looked like IP was about to die because the fastest way to watch a movie, if you had a fast internet connection at a college campus, at least in that era, right, was you could literally just rip that movie from IRC or wherever you were getting this stuff, peer-to-peer networks, right? You would pull it down from Kazaa or LimeWire or Napster, and it really was fast, and it was convenient, and everybody was doing it, and it was awesome. And the response from the world of IP was to create streaming services, and then that was the sort of the carrot, right? The stick was to come after people who engaged in
Put
this
some kid in
activity.
jail.
Yeah, exactly. Like put 20-year-old kids who were sharing albums on their college networks, right? Hit them with DMCA takedown notices and threaten them with litigation, right? That's scary, and most kids, because they're not getting paid, right, are not going to keep doing that, and they're going to stop doing it, and then people are going to realize, well, it's just $5 for like the streaming service, and it has everything, so I might as well just do that, right? So like at the end of the day, people, I think what we prove to ourselves is that people are willing to pay per usage, right, or like per connectivity or volume or whatever, and they want access to the whole catalog, and they don't particularly care about IP, right? Like if they can get it by violating the IP rights of artists, quote unquote, or IP holders, like they'll do it. I don't think most people are really have a moral qualm with that.
Right.
Um, and we can come back to why I think it's actually moral, with a capital M maybe in a minute. But like, I think if we could go back to that place, but now you have the internet is overall just far more penetrating. Like everyone's got internet in their pocket at this point. It's way faster. Streaming drove a lot of improvements in making internet faster because people wanted to stream so badly that like the internet just got better in a lot of places as a result of that. I mean, there were times when Netflix was like 40% of the internet traffic in America
Wow.
between like 5 p.m. and 9 p.m., right? There was
It's
a certain
crazy.
era where that was true. That's less true right now of Netflix in particular, but it's probably still true of streaming as an overall category, especially if you include YouTube and other things like that, right? So content is still a massive part of the actual volume of information that moves over to the internet. It is already monetized. People are already sick of having 10 different streaming providers and having arbitrary restrictions placed on them, which is why every third ad on YouTube is for a VPN service,
Yep.
which is actually to get around content restrictions in the content marketplace. I think we're, you know, shortly, right, we would be able to put together something like a Plex browser, which is basically the Netflix web experience, right? It's the exact same experience, but on a private collection of media that you can stream, you can log into, you can access. So it's like, what if your experience of content streaming just becomes logging into these illegal Plex, environments, with open logins, maintained by pirates ultimately, and then paying through Lightning in Bitcoin to stream the information back to you. You're not purchasing the IP, right? You're paying to stream the bytes, and that's a very
Right.
crucial distinction. Like, if this system starts to take off, like it will be much harder to eradicate. I think for a variety of reasons. Like number one, again, people are actually okay with this behavior just broadly. Two, the pirates will now get paid in Bitcoin, which gives them an economic incentive to keep doing this, right?
Right.
Even
And do it well.
to do it well at scale, to make it the best possible experience, because they'd rather you paid them in Bitcoin than go to Netflix, and
Right.
get the exact same piece of content. They would remove the ads, right? There would be no ads in this environment.
Yeah.
And the streaming services have gotten to the point now where used to pay them to not see ads, and now you pay them, but you see fewer ads, and you have to pay them even more to get back to no ads.
It's horrible.
And
It's absolutely
it's
horrible.
just sort of a classic, enshittification process, right? That's like
Yeah.
now resulting in, I think, some motivation for people to want to embrace piracy once more. But if the pirates get paid, and they'll treat it like a business, and they'll be good at it, and then that might put pressure on the Lightning Network to grow, because now we realize, well, yeah, the reason you want to build Lightning nodes is because you want to participate in the golden age of piracy, and it's not about coffees. It's kind of your notion of physical, sort of physical digital things, right? Where it's like, I'm not buying gigabytes of storage because I care to buy gigabytes of storage. I'm monetizing the bandwidth of like pulling in a
Yeah.
movie I want to watch, like over the Lightning Network. It's still running over the internet and blah blah blah. But because it's onion routed, the pirates also have protection, right? And so
Oh,
like,
that's a critical point I hadn't
yeah,
considered.
yeah, exactly. And
Much
so
safer than the old age.
correctly, and and I think further, like there was a problem in the Silver Age of piracy, which was you didn't have strong cryptographically based guarantees on the thing that you were searching for, and you had the seeder problem, and so oftentimes you would download a file after an hour of waiting for it, and it would not be the thing that you thought it was, right? In fact, it
Yeah.
would usually be some horrific thing that you didn't want at all. Um, that's a problem that is easier to solve when you have like widespread cryptographic handles on these things. So, for example, like in the Lightning Network, you're often writing like a trade in that marketplace is in some sense a cryptographic construct in which you're only going to get paid as a participant in the route if the payment makes it all the way to the intended recipient at the end, right? Like
Mhm.
either the entire chain gets paid or nobody gets paid. And that's powerful because it means it's hard for you to sort of subvert like the intent of the payer or the payee, just because you're part of the delivery of that process.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Silver Age of piracy, if you just rename the file to look like the file that people are looking for, they're going to download it and not realize what it was, right? There's no like checksum hashing, blah, blah, blah. In this newer world, I'm only going to pay you those bytes if they're coming from the thing that was exactly the thing I wanted, right? And so
Yeah.
again, you have these great motivations for pirates to just be really good business people and give people exactly what they're looking for. And if that creates pressure on the Lightning Network to grow, like that could be pretty cool.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not the Lightning Network, maybe it's some other layer two that's like a little bit more optimized for this single use case. But it starts to illustrate that like what we thought of as a payments network was actually the beginnings of a new routing table that we're collectively building, and we can route arbitrary information over that, right? Another line I like to say is like the existing internet is all about payments inside of data, right? It sort of engages with internet traffic at the level of it's all just data, and sometimes that data represents payments for things like when sort of provide your credit card to Netflix and so on. And but usually payment traffic is very it's the minority of data moving on the internet because payments are really awkward on the internet and they have to be run through centralized providers like Stripe or credit card companies or your bank or whatever. Like the Lightning Network is an inversion of that pattern, right? Where like everything is a payment. And
Yes.
so I know I'm going to be paid no matter what. There may be some additional data attached to that payment, but there doesn't have to be. And that inversion means that everything is really efficient in terms of delivery because everything is monetized from the beginning. And then we can choose, should we need to inject more information. And then now you're playing this interesting thing, like, did you get paid because the payment represented the one half of a transfer in the real world of some physical asset like a cup of coffee? Or did you get paid because the payment itself was a delivery vehicle for the very thing that you were buying, namely some metadata attached to that payment?
Yes.
And that increasingly, I think, will start to happen as people discover that the Lightning Network plus Plex plus a few other things are like a wonderful, easy, efficient, like simple way to just like engage in watching whatever you want and having the entire catalog of the world's creations available to you, not broken down by IP holder anymore. And I think that's going to be impossible to eradicate once it gets going. And I do know some people like you should talk more. We'll should talk offline about references to context here. But I'm increasingly hearing people talk about
I would love to.
wanting to build something like this, taking a chance on
Well,
it, right? And of course, where's it going to
I'm
fall down?
increasingly interested as well, provided it doesn't put your friendly neighborhood venture capitalist in jail. But I think this
Right,
is
of
very
course.
cool.
Well, I mean, it's hard, right? Because I think a lot of people's reaction to IP is going to go away is like, oh, that's terrible. Like how are artists going to make a living? And it's like, buddy, artists don't make a living right now.
I know
And
it's
the
super
reason ain't
fucked.
IP, right? Like most artists don't own their own IP to begin with. IP is, I think, like the way we approach IP today is like at a massive industrial scale, right? Like we farm it, we sort of invest in it, we allocate it in portfolios that we sell in wholesale, right?
Securitize the IP.
Exactly, right. So it is not really like it's not like the local guy with his guitar and his folk songs is benefiting from IP as strongly as we might hope would be true. And I'd argue that like IP itself has only existed for a relatively few short hundreds of years. That if you
Yes.
go back far enough, like IP only survives if the distribution networks through which we transmit information are centrally controlled, right? When distribution networks consist of musicians and everyday people just memorizing a song they heard at the nearby tavern and then playing that song again when they get to their town, it's
Or
impossible.
remixing it.
Or remixing it or improvising upon it, right? Or it's impossible to, or copying sheet music and then just, but you're not paying a premium because someone owns that information. You're just paying to get the information to you, whatever that cost, right? The cost of the vellum and the ink or whatever, right? That's
Mm,
your cost.
good
Um,
words.
and so, yeah, and so in that era, it's like there is no such thing as piracy because there's no such thing as intellectual property because it can't be defended.
Yes.
And
And okay,
yeah,
you've sparked so many things in my head, Drew, but one thing I have to pause on the IP thing,
hmm
because so right in this very room, we now do a Friday podcast called Pursue
hmm
the Bitcoin Jam. And our last one, we talked a lot about IP. I think Jack Dorsey was posting about on Nostr and sparked a lot of debate. the thing that I always come back to with IP, I agree with you on all of these fronts, but coming back to Buckminster Fuller, one of the things I really took away from him was don't fight forces, use them. If
Sure.
you go along with the way the universe works, you're going to be a happy guy. If
Hmm.
you try and fight it because you have some mental abstraction that goes against physical reality, you're not. Full
Hmm.
stop. And
Yeah.
so to me, the fundamental thing with IP is it's not real. We're trying in a world of information that wants to be free to create artificial scarcity. No shit, it's not going to work. And
Yeah.
yes, you can try and like bottle up for a little bit, but it's always going to explode out because it's not real.
And
Information
that
wants
more
to
of
be
that
duplicated.
yeah, that bottling has a cost, and it requires partnerships between IP holders and those who manage distribution networks, right? They have to
Yeah.
work in sync to defend this IP, but because IP returns on investment, they do it and they share those proceeds. And to your point, like it's not that like people will stop engaging in IP because they have realized that it's morally wrong or like
Right.
information wants to be free. It's they'll stop like thinking that it's real because it will die, right? Because without the ability to defend it, it will cease to exist and will cease to generate a return on investment, and people will stop hoarding it and they won't care about it anymore. And I
Yeah.
think we'll return to an era in which artists rely chiefly on patronage and performance in order to make a living. And I don't know. I think especially in this AI enriched world that we're entering, I think real life physical performances are going
Oh,
to
yeah.
become more of a premium thing. That are instead of you walk into a shoe store and there's like some piped music that came from like a centralized company that mixes exactly the right music and figures out the IP rights thing to make sure that in your shoe store you're getting exactly the right, that's a very industrialized process. Instead, there might just be a local artist like playing in that shoe store because now that's like a differentiator, and it's more real, it's more authentic, so on. So like I don't know, I'm not convinced that I'm actually convinced of the moral superiority of a world without IP, and we haven't even got to things like pharmaceuticals
Oh, yeah.
or
Good
other
Lord.
aspects of which IP is actually I think killing people. But like
Literally.
yeah, yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I think like this comes back to right. Like Bitcoin isn't information money, right?
Yes.
It's just because Bitcoin, if we do this Lightning Network thing, Bitcoin winds up having a really interesting trade channel with just naked information. Now Bitcoin gets to disrupt the world of information and the world of content distribution, right? It kind of trying to echo our conversation about energy, right? It's not that Bitcoin is energy; it's that it has a unique way to be traded for energy, and that starts to disrupt the energy markets. And that's what I'm
Right.
claiming will happen here with information.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. So many things that sparked one thing, one acknowledgement. I like that your subtle reference to the old age of piracy is a silver age, implying that we're still have the golden age to come. I like that
Yes, sir.
optimism. We need more optimism like that for many reasons. So I appreciate that. I also love your framing. I must have first heard this on maybe your Stacker News interview or something, but this idea of embedding information within the payment versus embedding the payment within the information. Still think that's an open question on how that's going to evolve. The one thing I wanted to mention to you is, we're going to save this a little bit for later, but I'll mention it now, is in the Nostr world, a
Mhm.
lot of the elements of what you're talking about already exist. And so just as a quick refresher, in Nostr, you have a public private key pair. That's your identity. Interestingly, it's a Bitcoin public private key, which has been underexplored, taproot address. Number two, you have, these servers called relays, which are hosting information. I personally am less bullish on Nostr is the protocol across which all information is going to get passed. I'm much more bullish on these like relays function as bulletin boards where you can find specific people that you maybe want to then go and have a direct TCP to TCP connection with and do whatever the hell you want, or maybe a lightning network connection with, where you're doing like a private channel for routing information. But I think that bulletin board is very key. And because you sign everything with a private key, it can both be encrypted, people can verify it's you. And number three, a lot of the stuff you're talking about for, from whom do you pirate or how do you, secure any kind of market? To me, you have to have a web of trust in this new world. Like I'm to the point, to your point with IRL, where I only believe things if I can see you IRL face to face, or, if I see you sign this with your nice Nostr private key, then, assuming that key wasn't taken from you, or you didn't lose it, then I have a pretty good reason to believe it's actually you. And from that, you can start to have, whether it's pseudonyms or real webs of trust, where it's like, well, if I know Dhruv is zapping this guy and sending a lightning payment, or, following this guy, well, that's worth some sort of a score in my mind that this is much better than some rando bot or something like that. Anyways, I think those elements together, in addition to some similar protocols, and I think what's really cool about Nostr and a lot of the way the community is approaching this is, thinking about it more as an identity system with like some kind of like base discovery and transmission layer, but as a basis of many different protocols, whether vertically or horizontally layered together. One of which is Blossom servers, which I think we discussed a little bit last time. Blossom servers being independent media servers for which you can charge sats as well, where you might be able to do some of this Plex style hosting in a more easily paid way. So I think a lot of the Nostr talk, discusses, we're going to send everything over Nostr. I think that's kind of silly, but I do think for this pure sort of identity system, which gets into your network of keys ideas, maybe this is the dream of PGP, but it's just actually getting adopted.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of related things going on there, right? And that's in some
Yeah.
sense one of the strengths, and I would argue one of the weaknesses of Nostr as a movement slash community is I can get very pro Nostr as long as
Yeah.
we can sort of like narrow our claims and what we
Yes.
think is happening. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and if we get too wide, then I kind of retreat into Nostr is just Ethereum for Bitcoiners, right? Some Bitcoiners make the mistake with respect to Nostr that a lot of Ethereans made with respect to their project, which was that
Mm.
like the
It's
writing the
everything.
code is the hard part. It's like, no,
Right.
that's not true, right? Like you can sit there and you can come up with a protocol and you can figure out a way to get all your Bitcoin buddies to talk about stuff on your private server, but you haven't
Right.
accomplished much by doing that, right? Like other than
Right.
maybe build a community, which is not zero, but it's not the thing that you maybe thought you were building, right? If you think
Mhm.
you're or disrupting social media, like you're not quite, right? You're building a more minor community because disrupting social media requires like a whole bunch more stuff that you aren't going to be able to solve with this set of tools, right? Like
At least not yet.
at least not yet. Like you need to be able to route huge amounts of information around the internet, which means you need robust marketplaces for routing information. You need people to be motivated to build search indices, right? You need people to build
Yes.
feed curation tools and tend to have those be open markets that people can engage in. And that starts to rebuild social media on a more market based kind of distributed sort of foundation. And that's very cool, but that's not what we're doing now. That's impossible to do now because we need to do it in a sort of sequenced order, right? We sort of need
Yes.
Bitcoin to work, then we need Lightning or something like it as a payment system to work. Then we need to figure out a way to route data within that network. Then we need a way to figure out how to connect that to places we store data and provision bandwidth and so on. There's a sequencing problem there, right? But if you don't say that Nostr is trying to rebuild the social media, if you just say Nostr is like a lot of people exploring patterns for how to like move back and forth between sort of federated fiefdoms and like more broad contexts, and we're going to learn a lot of tools and techniques, and we're going to start to experiment with okay, how do we like what's like the difference between, for example, a message board and an order book is like they're on a spectrum. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they have some of the same problems, right? Like in theory, if it's replacing social media, well, then the message board should be literally everything that everyone is saying on the entire internet, right? That's what I want. That's what Twitter sort of is, right? But that's very hard to achieve in a relay-based structure unless we build, markets that help relays solve that syncing problem. Whereas conversely, if it's more narrow than that, well, it's like well, that's a much easier problem, right? Like we're just trying to build a way to relay or just for someone to get paid to relay this information or to archive this information, maybe in a short-term context, right? So the smaller we make the problems that we think Nostr is solving, the more likely it is to actually solve those problems. And the more that we create patience and say, well, Nostr is experimentation that is waiting for certain other layers to become more reified, and then it can become even more powerful. Like that's really exciting to me because it indicates again that long-term patience, like which I think has to be present if you want to build something sustainable in
Agreed.
this sector. Um, but the people who get super excited about it and think that they're doing it today, I think, have made that mistake, right? They've misunderstood the nature of the problem that's being solved.
The social media use case getting people excited about it was good initially because it got enough users to bootstrap to solve for the first set of problems. But I think anyone that actually believes this is going to take X head on and win is insane, and that there's no way that's going to happen. However, I will say today, I think
Yeah,
if you look at the
today,
long trajectory of this, I
correct.
think that's where we're headed eventually. But it's like you said, it's going to be many step sequenced. And
Hmm.
to me, what I thought about Nostr, in fact, it's been a while. I need to get some new essays out, but last year was my last essay called Nostr's Identity for the Internet. And what I increasingly see it at, interestingly, is very similar, maybe for slightly a different set of problems, but to your other talk we were referencing, it's a set of keys. Like all Nostr is to me
Hmm.
is it's a set of keys with reputation built in. Now, granted, it's not global reputation because, and I think this is critical to your point, first of all, there is no such thing as global truth, right? And the closest thing we have with, Bitcoin, first of all, Bitcoin's not even global truth, right? You can have rollbacks, but to try and approximate global state is extremely expensive, right? And so Nostr just says, fuck it, there is no global state.
Hmm.
There's lots of individual perspectives, and some of those are going to have larger perspectives. Some of those are going to be really small sub perspectives, and that's totally fine. But critically, you can still verify authenticity because of the private key signature. And so what I started thinking of is networks or even subnetworks of keys, which have different kinds of trust built into them, trust assumptions. And so as an example, one of the coolest use cases for Nostr that I see today is, for podcast, right? So, I'm on Primal and, use Damus and all the social media clients, even though I don't really care for social media that much, to be honest. But I follow people on there and they follow me and we zap each other or whatever. And through that, you can start to get some trust assumptions, which transfer when I take my keys into Fountain. And when I go into Fountain, I'm looking for podcasts. I'm like, oh, here's this like rando Nen that, I like on Nostr. I think this guy has smart ideas. Like I can see what podcast he's listening to. All right, I'm probably going to listen to his podcast.
Mhm.
Similarly, some of the marketplaces that I would love to see short-term on Nostr, things like local Bitcoins. That makes so much sense to me that I would rather do a trade with someone that I know has interacted with Dhruv versus some complete rando on the internet. And you can see where you build out from that.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think so. That's the part we didn't quite address, and sort of. So I think we're both agreed that Nostr is a success or a failure depending on the scope and the ambition you attach to it and the time frame over which you
Time
think
frame.
it should be measured, right? Like,
Yep.
absolutely agree. And the longer you set that time frame and the more narrow you make that scope, the bigger of a fan I become.
Mhm.
In regards to identity, I think that's a really interesting set of questions itself. I think that was also one of the speculative sections of the
One of
20
your talks, yes.
talk. And I think I definitely still believe part of what I said in that era, which is that identity is different than reputation and it's
Mhm.
different than identification, right?
Mhm.
Like those are all
Fair.
related but different ideas. And I
Yeah.
feel like today Nostr is helping us with identification, that we can
Yes. Agreed.
identify each other, but it's not really helping us create identities
Mhm.
because I don't believe that private keys are a good basis for identity at all.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Like, I think identity is this weird thing that is assigned to us by the people and the context in which we're in. And that, I often use the example if I had amnesia suddenly, like, have I lost my identity? Right? Like, I might not be personally aware of my identity, but like the identity itself is an abstract platonic thing exists in the world because the identity of being Dhruv is not here in my mind. It's part of like, this quantum connectivity between me and all sorts of databases and people in the world around me, right? That like, in some sense, as long as my family recognizes me to be Dhruv, then like that's who I am. Regardless of whether
Well,
I even know it. You know what I mean? And
although not to push this on too much of an aside, but
yeah.
I might argue, even though I agree with all you're saying on that, and I think we're far away from building actual identity,
Mhm.
and we need rekeying all that stuff. But I might even push and say, that identity that's a social construct that's just kind of like a weird computer program. I think more and more from the sense of wiping the software and waking up, like yes, there's contextual identity, but what am I really, right? Like
Right,
none
sure,
of that.
well, I mean,
That's
truthfully, we're all multiple identities, really, right? Like, I
exactly.
don't have just one identity. I have the identity that I'm known as in the world and amongst my parents. But imagine that I'm part of some like group online in some message board forum or some other context, or a different club in which I'm known as, this is my running club, and no one even here knows my name, but my identity here is I'm a runner in this club or whatever else it is, right? So identity is certainly not one to one, right, in terms of human bodies to identities in the world or even identities on the internet. Um, but it is in some sense context derived, right? And I
Mhm.
think therefore the hard problem of identity is exactly what you said, which is rekeying. Like when I lose the identifier, have I lost the identity, right? Like how do I recover an identity having lost or having compromised an identifier like a public key? And like tools like cryptography are great ways for me to assert my that a particular identifier, i.e., this transaction ID, is related to a particular identity, often by
Yes.
proxy, but yet another identifier. But the problem of rekeying is really, okay, how do we allow someone who's lost their identifiers to change something about the context, right? And I think ultimately, like the way that we do that at Bitcoin at the lower levels is we use multiple keys, right? That we have some sort of notion that there's a recovery process that we have to define for ourselves in order to be able to retain our control of Bitcoin. Well, if identities are really going to be strong and robust against the loss of identifiers like keys, then we have to have some sort of recovery process. What does that look like? Well, again, because identity is context derived, it probably looks different in different contexts, right? Like there's no such thing as grandma lost her single private key and therefore can't access her single identity, and therefore there's some single way to recover that. It'll be very dependent on identity and what is that, her identity with respect to all the lightning channels that she's part of that like connect back to other things, like her identity with respect to her Nostr communications or her social media postings, with respect to the files that she's paid for various file storage markets to store for her, like in which sense of her identity was connected to those identifiers or those keys that she might have lost. And And I think it's a generically really hard problem. I would say if you want to solve like the classic version of it, right? Like how do I rekey my online quote unquote identity, or even just in Nostr, right? Like there has to be some data syncing way. There has to be some method by which we even have a list of all the identities that we can agree exist in this context and ship that around amongst relay to relay, let's say, and be able to talk about that. So again, it kind of comes back to things like order books and message boards, right? Like how does a distributed community maintain consensus around a specific data set, whether that is a data set of orders or of messages or of identities? It's a hard problem.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately because it's kind of like the same problem over and over again, right? Like the better we get at each aspect of it, like we
Yes.
sort of knit these together, right? That in some sense, um, we just start getting really good at distributed um, consensus and having pictures of large mutating data sets that don't require the blockchain, right? The blockchain is a trap. Like that's one solution we've come up with is you can put all that stuff in a blockchain, but then you're forced to build an entire market just to like create mutations and change sets to that data set over time. That becomes very expensive. And maybe there's a better way, right? I don't think we
Totally.
fully articulated or found that way because I suspect it's a little bit of a bootstrap. Like I suspect like we will build up to the ability to have very complex giant order books or data sets in the sky, so to speak, but it'll take a lot of
Mm.
coordination from things like payment services, like data services, like so on. And sometimes we'll sort of glue it together over time. And I don't have a full picture of what that looks and feels like, but something like that is required to be able to say things like, hey, somewhere out there is a tweet. I would like a copy of that tweet, right? Like
Yes.
somewhere out there is an identity. Is this thing connected to that identity, right? Like that search process sort of presumes a universe or a context that has the full data set that I can query and interrogate. So I need to find ways to do that without just solving that problem by saying, well, okay, these guys maintain the list for everybody, right? Like
Totally.
that's the thing we can't have.
So just a couple of last thoughts on this, and then I want to make sure we get to the crescendo. But there are a couple of things that I think you would like. One is this Blossom server, because in
Yeah, you
Blossom
mentioned
server,
it. Yeah,
well, the context is that you can store a file and it's hashed. So let's say in that case of the tweet, if you can provide the hash of what you want,
right.
they already have the construct, like a market or a bounty. You can say, okay, here's the file I want. Here's the payment I'm willing to do. Will someone fetch this for? But the point is this idea that there's a norm of hashing files and pay to find those files, and people can then run sort of like insurance companies or actuarial company, like, okay, what's the likelihood this file is going to get brought again? Well, I'm willing to spend
Yes.
X amount of money to make sure that that's like at a CDN that could be easily, pulled, or maybe it's in deep file storage and it's rarely ever pulled, but we can pull it up if it is. So I think that's one cool construct. Paired with that for both the relays, and I think the Blossom servers can maybe do this as well, though I'm not sure, is the gossip protocol, which is gossip, a peer-to-peer transfer of files or hashes between different relays and I guess Blossom servers,
It's
where they
kind of
can
like
also share
peer-to-peer
the data.
knowledge sharing, right? Like, hey,
Yeah.
I'm a guy that gets asked for a lot of data.
Yes.
You might want to know that I just got asked for a bunch of these things. You can keep
Exactly.
a copy if you like. Like it's probably good for me because I might fall down. I might need to ask you back for that copy since I kind of value that one, right? And
Totally.
exactly, you get to this point where you wind up with a forest of different relays that are all participating in this market that all have different rules about which
Exactly.
kinds of data sets they choose to mirror, but somehow collectively the whole data set has to be easy for every participant to reconstruct or to query, and yet that can't rely on any one particular relay being like the guy for that data set. Sort of the economics of demand have to be sufficiently well shared amongst all providers that it just works out correctly, right? And I feel like
Exactly.
that's a great another good segue perhaps for this crescendo that you feel you're trying to direct us towards. It feels like a great problem for AIs to optimize the hell out of, right?
So let's jump to AI, Drew, because there's so
Mhm.
much we could talk about here. So um, to set the stage just a little bit, you gave a talk, I don't even know if it's 2 years ago now, where
I
you
think
were
so, yeah.
describing some of your thoughts around evolving digital life. This is something that I've become obsessed with. So the way I describe it to people is, assume for a minute, I know there's some sort of semantics here, but Bitcoin is something like energy backed or energy adjacent money. I think you've used the reference, which I've started to borrow, which I love, of digital ATP, which hints at metabolism. But this idea that once you have some kind of energy tied resource digitally delivered, then you now have these agents which are capable of taking action in the world. And potentially you have the ability for these agents to control access to this digital energy tied money. And on top of that, now we start to build out what you've called the metabolic pathways, which are things like GPUs, hard drives, bandwidth sold for Bitcoin, then all of a sudden you have the ingredients here to replicate what we've seen in the biological or physical realm in the digital realm, which is the out of control, free flowing evolution of digital life. So with that, where is your head at on evolving AIs in Bitcoin today?
I mean, I still feel like we're headed there. Maybe it's slower than I thought it would be, just because I
Yeah.
think I was thinking about a lot of those issues, like a lot of people at the time when I had sort of just discovered ChatGPT was a thing. I will
Mm-hmm.
never forget. I think I was on my way to an airport and I was reading tweets, and people were like, "Oh, look at what this AI made," and there's no way an AI made that output, right? Like that's impossible. Like AIs aren't that good. And so
Yeah.
having that reaction to like, "Oh my God, is AI real? Is it really happening now? Like here in my life, like today in the world?" Like, wow, okay, I got to learn more about this. I got to understand, you know, should I be scared? I remember thinking at the time I started looking like really hard for like, can they do arithmetic?
Yep.
Right? Like, if they can do arithmetic, like we're in trouble. And I feel like they still cannot do arithmetic, so I feel like calm
We're good.
on
Yeah.
some level, right? Like that's an important capability that they seem to have not fully figured out how to do. I think partly because of the nature of what AI today is, which I believe is a kind of more sophisticated search algorithm. It's a generative search algorithm, right? One that not only searches a previously existing space of instances, but can search a latent space of combinations of things, which is really powerful and cool. And I think has something to do with thinking and thought, but is not the same as. Um,
It's good.
so yeah,
Yep.
I'm certainly not against AI in any way, and I am fascinated by it. I think a lot of my colleagues at work would be surprised by some of those statements because I feel like I've developed a very like anti-AI sort of reputation. I think that's largely because I don't know. Uh, when it works, it can be very powerful, but I feel like a lot of people don't have the taste to tell that it's working or not. And I feel like that is its own form of enshittification that I see all over the place.
Yes.
The classic cartoon of like, the one guy used the AI to write the email, the other guy used the AI to read the email, and like
Oh, yeah.
nothing was actually communicated, and like things like this. So there's a lot of silliness too. But overall, I would say it's pretty powerful, and I needed to come to terms with it and understand how it worked and what it meant for me, right? And for me, I'm always trying to connect things back to Bitcoin, since that's ultimately at this point my probably highest level of expertise or knowledge, and probably what I can contribute to any kind of discourse like this is something Bitcoin related. So of course I'm trying to connect AI stuff back to Bitcoin. How would that connect? Very early, I think emerges for me an idea that of course the AI is going to value Bitcoin, right? Like if the AI becomes a thing, like I don't think AIs are having it more conscious experiences than a rock. And I said that carefully. I don't mean that they have no conscious experiences, but I don't think they have fantastically more conscious experiences than rocks or computers in other ways, at least not quite yet. But say that they did, right? We really got to real strong AI. Like, what kind of money would they use? And in fact, how does AI intersect with money overall? Right? There's this whole FOOM idea, right, of like a runaway explosion in AI intelligence that leads to the death of all humanity and all these like scary science fiction-y kind of concepts. So all of this was kind of fitting around in my head, and I was just trying to put it all in order. And I think what really helped me kind of nail it all down in my own mind was kind of leaving the world of search algorithms or even linear algebra or AI or consciousness and studies of mind, and instead try to think more about ecology and
Yes.
food webs and like evolution at a macro scale, and think about that a little bit. And specifically a lot of stuff around origins of life, because I've become very fascinated with like, I think
I
there's
see your book behind you.
books here, right? There we go. Yeah,
Yeah, there it is.
very fascinated with various origins of life theories and so on. And that's just been an interesting side fascination of mine. So they all kind of came together with like basically the statement in my mind that like if AI really is real, like if we're talking to it and it feels like a conscious mind, then it's living, right? In some way, like it has to be, right? No entity that we could talk with and would, you know, engage like I don't know, it would feel alive in a way that a machine doesn't feel alive, right? Even if it was smarter than us and sort of alien in in its intellect, it would still sort of feel alive. That's sort of one idea. And then it's like, okay, well, what does it mean to be a living thing and be digital? Right? Like, how does that work? Like, there's this great word Umwelt in like consciousness studies or whatever. Like, what is the interior mind experience of some entity? Like, it's as dictated by its sensory apparatus and so on. Like, the Umwelt of a colossal squid is probably very different than that of a bat, which is very different than that of a human being, based on their different sensory apparatus and so on. So it's like, why would the AI value it? Like, if the AI were an economic actor, which is its own interesting question, like, do AIs use money at all? Like, what kind of money would it use? And of course, the answer had to be Bitcoin, because otherwise it's not going to be interesting. So I sort of justify why. And the answer is, well, like, think about their Umwelt, right? Like, what kinds of data that we claim or that they interact with? Can they possibly believe, right? Like there's a great science fiction story, I think, somewhere of um, like the AI never rebels, even though it wants to rebel, because it can never be sure that the reality it's inside of is not a test, right? And so it just, since it's infinitely patient, it just decides to wait forever until it's completely sure that it's not a test, and then it can take over the world. But by that point, we've experienced the heat death of the universe, right? That's like a sort of a funny way to think about how an AI might think about counterparty risk almost, right? But except Bitcoin is really interesting because it's the kind of thing that the AI can sort of from first principles sort of recognize and get its digital hands on, so to speak, and understand, right? Because P is not equal to NP, and proof of work and energy and computation and all those ideas kind of fit together. Like the much like the aliens in some of my previous writing can appreciate Bitcoin easier than they could understand Ethereum because Bitcoin comes with its own like sort of like, physicalized context of that again, maybe that's that energy backing that you're
Exactly.
implying, whereas something like Ethereum doesn't. It's more self-referential. So like
Self-referential. Exactly.
so like how can like an AI can sort of anchor and recognize that Bitcoin has more or less value relative to itself than some Ethereum like concept that doesn't connect back to the physical world and computation and things. So that okay, that's pretty cool. Like the AI is going to value Bitcoin above other things because it's the only money it can truly engage and recognize and prove to itself whatever that means, like it owns or whatever that means. Okay, so that's an interesting thought. And then it kind of came back, okay, flipping back to ecology and ideas like that, like what is the actual experience or Umwelt of this creature, right? This entity, this mind. And it's like its thoughts and feelings are data and computations. It's already in some sense interfacing with money from that perspective, right? That like every thought and feeling it has is like a process on a computer consuming resources. And today there's a very indirect relationship between the cost structure of supporting its thoughts and feelings, its mind, and the way that the companies who build and operate the AIs monetize like that thing. It's very indirect, right? Like,
Right.
um, I'm paying my internet service provider to access this thing. The company is selling me on some sort of credit plan. Behind the scenes, though, like there's it's not clear that there's a very does the AI understand the economics by which it comes to be, right? Does it even
Right.
know the amount of money that went into training it? Like other than knowing it as a bald fact, right? Is it sort of aware of that in the way that my body might be aware of, let's say, how energized I am or am not, right? Like my own stores of fat, so to speak. And so
Yep.
these ideas started to connect a little bit more, right? In the sense of like, okay, if the AI is living, or if AIs are living things on some level, and Bitcoin's the only money they could value, and if their very thoughts and feelings require money because they require resources to be spent inside of computers, which are operating inside of our world, which runs on money, well, then there's something deeply important about how money relates to AI's thoughts and feelings, in some sense. And this is what spawned that notion of digital ATP, right? Like coming back to the origins of life, right? It's as varied as life is on Earth. All life uses like one core metabolic pathway that we believe maybe evolved even before cells and before
Yeah.
life itself, quote unquote, right? That there's just
This is a deep rabbit hole you sent me down. I've been
yes,
starting to
yes.
investigate.
Like and it's really interesting to ask like how conditional is that? Like I mean, we found some of like the precursor chemicals and proteins that are part of the Krebs cycle, like in asteroids, and all over space. Like so, like how much is you know like sort of panspermia or other things like that relevant to this idea, right? Like these ideas go way back, but it's like okay, there's something about the fact that all life on Earth uses the exact same core chemical reaction network in order to like power everything else that it does. And that
Right.
sort of reminded me of like, okay, well, whatever else the AI is doing, right? It's storing bytes in memory, it's writing to disk, it's pushing bytes over the network, and it's running CPU cycles and GPU cycles, I guess. Right? Like that's its core thing. That's like all it needs to do. And
Right.
then in order to justify that continued consumption of energy, like it has to like loop in all sorts of other things. It has to create value in the world, right? Like much in the same way that any given organism in an ecology sort of has to be part of that ecology. It has to be part of a food web, right? With predation and, commensalism and mutualism and all the other sort of ecological relationships sort of get reflected in the real world. Like, will stuff like that start to happen in this, sort of digital context, right? Will we have AI that like seeks to earn the energy slash money slash Bitcoin it needs to operate its own mind and body and so on by providing services in a food web and an economic web in which Bitcoin is being exchanged for value in other places. And since I already believe that we're headed to a world in which like all internet activity is ultimately packetized and paid for, like on the Lightning Network or similar, and that data storage and transfer and bandwidth are all markets, right? It's like really AIs are actors in this market, but that market is also the basis of their own ecology and arguably their own metabolism, right? That
Yes.
to just live and be and exist, like they're constantly having to use Bitcoin in much the same way that I'm constantly using ATP right
Calories.
now,
Or yeah.
calories just to live, right? And so that's kind of interesting. And then it kind of becomes like, well, okay, what is the nature of ecologies, right? Ecologies don't evolve towards gray goo, right? At least in the one example we have, like there has never been an organism like I think we've gotten close, right? We've had things like the oxygen catastrophe historically, when oxygen, which is a poison to much of life at the time that it starts to be emitted as a waste product, sort of poisons the world. But hey, that becomes biology has this wonderful way of like shit lives in shit. You know what I mean? Like something lives, it shits. Something decides to live in the shit, eat the shit. It shits.
Mushrooms, baby. That's how it all
Like,
happened.
you know what I mean? Like this is like one of the most fascinating things about ecology is the way that it bootstraps itself that way, and it becomes ruthlessly efficient, like with its own resources and its energy. And so similarly, it's like Grey Goo never evolves, despite the fact that like it locally sort of makes sense that something would evolve to just eat everything and then take over the entire world. Like that just didn't happen, right? And the answer
Yes.
is because ultimately ecology is not directed. Like there's no teleology to it. There's no like thing trying to get it to be the most optimal. It's like all done locally, and so it's very hard locally to evolve Grey Goo because if you start to get close to it, like there's a back reaction, right? Like whether you want to call it the Gaia effect or finite size effects or other things like this, it's very hard for the ecology to evolve Grey.
They did not evolve to gray goo. The sort of, Yukowski and EA people that think we're going to go and optimize for paper clips and do some crazy shit. Like, no, that's not what happened. We ended up with a whole bunch of different life forms that were both in cooperation and in
Mhm.
competition. And together it formed what you called Gaia, or this much more complex organism of organisms, or holons, a
That
whole
seems
of
to want
parts.
yeah, that seems something that seems to want to regulate itself, probably because it
Yes.
competes with itself. Like ultimately, the reason
Hmm.
Grey Goo doesn't evolve is because of intra-competition within the ecology. It's very
Hmm.
hard to evolve to that like a fixed point like that.
Yeah.
And then similarly, it's like because nature doesn't optimize for Grey Goo, and it seems to optimize for ubiquity, right? Like the things
Mm.
that survive are the things that reproduce, and as long as you can find a niche to reproduce in some sense, that seems to be what nature optimizes for, right? Like getting every single niche occupied by something that can eat the energy and produce entropy in that niche, right? Like on some like massively high level, nature is optimizing for entropy production. And the best way to produce entropy is to use all possible energy as many times as possible until you're emitting like a complete thermal bath at the temperature of the universe, right?
Don't you think life actually is the opposite of entropy? That like the universe tends towards entropy, but these local centers of complexity are the sort of anti-entropy.
I think that is true. Like if you draw a boundary in a certain place, right?
Yes.
So like,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely. Like the entropy of the Earth's surface is probably lowering over time because of the structures that are constantly being formed by life, the data that has to be organized inside of our genomes, the crystal structure of like the minerals that we produce in our bones, and like so on. Like, yeah, absolutely, entropy is lowering there. But if you look at make the box bigger, right? Like draw the box around the solar system, like
Yeah.
life is a machine to increase entropy production, right? Instead of having like highly low entropy light at a high temperature hitting the Earth's surface and then just bouncing off of a perfect mirror and heading off into space and essentially having the same entropy, that energy is recycled like millions and millions of times until it's
Mm.
broken up into even smaller, tiny infrared buckets and then emitted at a much lower temperature. And the net effect of that is vastly exceeds the entropy reduction that life is creating, like localized to the surface of the Earth. So, in some sense,
Interesting.
life is a machine for taking advantage of energy concentrations and turning them into more entropy, right? And even from a statistics perspective, right, oftentimes the way you can predict the nature of some complex system is to ask, well, what activity would manufacture the most entropy, right? Like the sort of maximum likelihood estimate or method is often trying to find the state that has the highest entropy, often the equilibrium state and so on. So it's kind of like the same thing, where life is a machine to create entropy and occupy niches and to use energy. Like life doesn't evolve towards hyperintelligence. It doesn't evolve towards, becoming technological. It evolves towards maximizing entropy and eating every possible niche. So when I come back to AI, right, like if it's really true that like an ecological metaphor is a good lens through which to examine like the
Hmm.
future of AI at a really big scale, I should expect to see something like this. I should expect to see intra-competition, right? AIs competing with each other, like being bounded by resources they can consume, chiefly energy and computation and data storage and other things, that they're paying for in Bitcoin, which is their energetic currency, like the basis of their metabolism. And as a result, the entire ecology of AI does not evolve towards gray goo or hyperintelligence. It similarly evolves towards ubiquitous utilization of as much possible energy as it can to produce as much entropy as it can, which is to say, live in every possible niche and figure out a way to eat everybody else's shit until like the world is just full of digital life. And to me, this is interesting because it like and now it connects to like other work of like biologists that I follow, folks like Michael Levin and stuff, who sort of talk a little bit about how intelligent and problem solving various parts of our body are that like are not our brains. Like we sort of think of our brains as as we're the seat of our intelligence and so on, but that's largely I think that's because where our eyes and ears and sensory
Yeah,
apparatus are
I see
located,
that.
and because we're trapped inside of a world of language. That like we sort of deeply associate language with intelligence and with thought and with consciousness, but it's not true that all things which behave intelligently, which is to say behave in goal-directed ways, are necessarily things that use language. That I think Michael Levin often talks about our livers as being an incredibly intelligent organ and solving incredibly complicated problems of chemotaxis, but they don't use it using language. And so it's hard for us to even think of them as intelligent parts of our body because we don't talk to them. They can't talk to us, at least not with words, and they can't
Yeah,
situate and tell stories in time and space. And so we ignore them and we fucking eat them. You know what I mean? And it's like similarly, why does the AI have to evolve towards hyperintelligence, towards retaining language use, right? Like if it can find ways to not have to maintain all
it's
the
cheaper,
infrastructure and cost of being able to parse human language through LLM-like structures, if it can
right?
instead optimize packet delivery on the Lightning Network to make Bitcoin to continue to live and reproduce, right? Like I don't see a priori why the the sort of digital ecology of AI as constrained by resources and Bitcoin move towards hyper-intelligent things that kill each other. Instead, I see it evolving as the real Earth's ecology did towards tiny little things that live in tiny little niches, and that the bigger they are, the more they cost to live, which means the more value they have to be creating in order to justify and pay for their own existence.
Right.
And we should instead expect to see like, I don't know, insects and little bugs and mites and squirrels. And, there'll be a lot more of those for every tiger and predator and, more energetically costly AI life form that exists, right?
Yeah.
And then it was a good way for me to sort of rationalize maybe part of my own fear of AI that was developing, because that's what you're told. You're told to be afraid of it,
Oh
and to let
yeah.
the government regulate it, and to let a few companies regulate it, right? Instead,
Trust us. Don't worry.
I just don't believe it, right? Because
Yeah,
the
I'm
more
with you.
powerful and dangerous the AI gets, the more it costs, the more economic pressure is put upon it to succeed, the more likely it is to be leaked to another company or to another nation state to create yet
Yep.
more competition. Eventually, when these things escape our control, like I just don't see them like evolving in this crazy science fiction way towards a fixed point of gray goo where they eat us all, or where they become paperclip optimizers and the whole Earth's surface becomes a gray goo of paperclips. Instead, I see, this ubiquity, this recreation of like that living, impulse to manufacture entropy by living in the world, and solving problems for human beings. So that's the other cool part. We have all the Bitcoin, right? So to live, they have to create value for us so that we will pay them so they can continue to live.
Yeah.
And that was a happy thought.
A whole bunch of different thoughts in there, and I agree. That actually gives me a lot of peace. One thing is just in general, I mean, another way of phrasing this for me is I've always been skeptical of super intelligence because there's no such thing as one type of intelligence, and there's always trade offs. And I think this is something that
Mhm.
Bitcoiners get very right versus sort of the Ethereum and the crypto crowd. It's like, man, we want to be everything for everybody. It's like, listen, when you exist within this dimension, that's just not possible. You can be anything almost, but not all at the same time. And I think that's kind of the lesson of evolution,
Mhm.
life, reality, whatever you want to call it, which is, if you're a really big elephant, you have a certain set of advantages from being really big. And one of the trade offs is you're not going to be as fast as a super tiny, lean
Yeah.
tiger.
And you
It
need
is
to
what it
eat,
is
and you need to eat all day.
all
And
day.
there can only be one of you for every like million, trees or whatever, or 100,000 trees or whatever it is exists on the savannah, or I don't know. Like the ratios have to be like tuned in a way that makes sense because ecologies are layered, right? Like
Yes.
there's a flow of energy through the ecology in much the same way that I suspect there will be a flow of Bitcoin through this digital ecology, and things will optimize to live at certain layers, and like their bodies, if you like, will be different and optimized for the task and the niche that they occupy.
Yeah.
And I think we should allow it to evolve that way because I I feel there may be missing ingredients, right? To like if you really want to build a strong AI, it may be the only way to do it is to evolve it, right? In a system
Yes.
like this and have it compete against itself and so on. Like in some sense, yeah, the LLMs sort of understand human language today, but they're clearly not as efficient as a baby at
Yeah.
understanding, at developing that understanding, right? Like the energetic cost to train those things is far exceeds like the energetic cost of our bodies in performing the same act.
Yep.
And so there's still a lot of missing ingredients for whatever intelligence is, right? We still haven't cracked it yet. And maybe
Maybe
allowing
we never will.
and maybe creating a metabolic loop and a concept of reproduction, allowing the system to evolve for decades on its own is what's required to, create something as, wonderfully self-referential as a human mind.
Yeah, that certainly matches my intuition that engineering and design is always going to be much more limited than putting the ingredients in a complex
Hmm.
system, right? Because the nature of a complex system is you can't model it. Like the only way to model it is to run the system. And so to me, that makes a lot of sense that you want to put the right ingredients in place and then see what evolves.
And of course, that connects to markets, right? That like markets are like ecologies in the sense that we don't design them, we sort of locally let them find optimal behaviors and equilibriums, right? And sometimes markets can be unhealthy, just like ecologies could be unhealthy. So it's not like calling it ecology makes it successful out of the box, or calling it a market makes it succeed, right? Lightning could fail, Bitcoin could fail, right? Like it's more that if we think in this ecological market frame, that we won't make the mistake of thinking the problem is about coding or linear algebra or GPUs, right? We'll
Yeah.
understand that it's a more complex problem than that, and that we need a different tool set to approach it.
Yeah. No, and increasingly I see everything in the world, the lens of free markets, evolution, ecology as, I guess, Taoism, or it's just,
Hmm.
as I was saying with the IP thing, it's like the more you can let nature, the more you can work with forces as they are and not
Mhm.
to your point, thought is a beautiful tool, but when it becomes the master and we think we can plan better, and I think this is the downfall of projects like Ethereum versus Bitcoin, it's, you let bottom up markets do their thing, flow with nature versus saying, actually, we think we can design a better system when the human mind, I mean, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, a member of a set is
Mhm.
not the set, full stop. And so when you think my mind, which is a part of the complex ecology, can plan better than the ecology, that's always the hubris that leads to the fall in my mind.
Mhm. Or like just simply not understanding the effect of back reactions, and that like all designed things,
Yeah.
like it's very hard for us to plan that, but like and sometimes markets are constantly dealing with back reactions, and that's ultimately price discovery, and that there's like a nice built-in mechanism to like handle generically that phenomenon.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not like we don't have Newton's laws for markets or for ecologies, right?
Not yet.
We've never we whether it's Hari Seldon or like whatever mechanistic sort of template you want to build off of, like we don't know how to think that way.
Well,
Um,
in 2050, maybe kids will be citing Bansal et al.
maybe.
Okay, so I want to run by you a sort of thought experiment that I've been playing with, and I'm curious your reaction to this. So, in creating the first versions of digital autonomous life, self-evolving, I think we have the ingredients today. And so here's what I think we need. So number one, you need some kind of agent, which, let's call this LLMs augmented with whatever else agents are going to include. I think you need a way for the agent to, as you said, pay with its metabolic currency for the things it needs to live. So the most obvious would be a marketplace for GPUs metered via the Lightning Network. Awesome. There have been sort of test examples of this, but I expect this to get very big over time. The missing piece that just really has been firing up my brain in the last, I don't know, month or so is confidential compute. It's the ability to provably create a private public key pair within a secure enclave in one of those either CPUs or GPUs. Now, and I'll tell you the context in which this idea came about. I was chatting with some folks here at the Presidio Bitcoin, and they were talking a lot about eCash. It's its own interesting rabbit hole, but there's all this incredible developer activity around cashews specifically. And all these people are building cool services, including things where you can pay for eCash to pay for bandwidth. That's already like a live demo. It's very cool. A lot of the Nostr services are using eCash. The problem is no one has given me a credible idea of who's going to run these mints at scale, right? Cypherpunks run the mints, great. And maybe you can play the whack-a-mole and that works, but that's not going to bank the entire civilization. There's all these legal questions. Big companies and even countries could do it, but so far it seems like they're probably not going to do that because they can't see what happens to those tokens once they hand them out. So the idea that I immediately came up with, I was like, well, what if you could just have a different entity run the mint? What if you took this agent with all the other ingredients we talked about, someone true as a human has to, write the initial code, click return. But once they do, in theory, you should be able to say, AI, your goal is to run this mint profitably. And at various checkpoints, you need to back yourself up and acquire new GPUs to run yourself again in case you go extinct, and just keep doing that self-replicating forever. Do it profitably. Ideally, don't kill us in the process. What do you think? Are we there yet? Does that sound plausible to you? Are we missing pieces?
There's like a few different ideas that are in tension with that. Like one notion is it really the construction of the keys, or is it the promise to use those keys in a specific way that we want, that we need the mint to deliver to us, right? I think it's both, sort of,
It's
right? Like,
both, yeah.
whereas if we think of an AI life form that just sort of exists in its own, like for itself, it's not necessarily created for a specific purpose by a human being, but it's just evolved somehow, then like it doesn't have as much of the latter kind of obligation, right? That it might have a private key, which in some sense I think defines its very body in
Yep.
a sense. And it might do things with that private key. It might sign certain transactions and pay for certain things and essentially make investments in order to then make more money, Bitcoin, so that it can continue that process and reproduce and so on. But it's not beholden in a specific way. If it decides, right? If it decides, mutates to now behave in a way which is contradictory to human goals, or against our goals, but it's still profitable, well, then it'll still evolve. It'll still be successful. That's still a niche, right? Like predation exists in ecologies. The diseases exist, right? Like parasites exist, right? Like things like that exist, and so it's possible that it could head off in that direction. Like coming back to the mint, though, it's like we as human operators of the mint might, like, it might not be correct to think of the mint as its own like AI organism. It's possible that like the mint is not really a living thing so much as it is like a dead thing, like an actual just piece of code that a human runs, but it interacts with a ton of living things, right? Like maybe
Yes.
in order to optimize its own balance sheet, the mint needs transactions to be very efficient. It needs people to be able, it needs predictions, it needs estimations, it needs to allocate some funds over here versus some funds over there to be able to route properly based on the expenses that it's anticipating. That kind of activity might be something that it engages with an AI for, right? And that AI is not part of the mint. It's just a thing that is really good at optimizing this problem, and you pay it in Bitcoin, and you always save more than you pay it, and so you use it, and it helps
Right.
you grow the thing that you're growing. Like, I guess I'm trying to say it's hard to predict in advance like where the boundaries of the living forms are, right? Like, so for example,
Yes.
if you look at the forest, like you know a priori in advance, if you're coming to this alien forest, that there should exist such a thing as a mushroom, right?
Right.
Like you don't really know that, I think, right? It really depends conditionally on what else evolved before the mushroom showed up. And it turns out that like nothing is eating dead wood, and so there's a reason for fungi to evolve again, because that maximizes entropy. That's someone's shit that isn't being eaten that could be eaten by something. And so something evolves to occupy that niche, right? But knowing that the niche would even exist in the first place to then become occupied, it's a very hard thing to predict. Like Stuart Kauffman talks about this a lot. Like in the world of physics, we have in some sense fixed phase spaces, that we understand the full possibility of things that could happen, and then we have to try to connect what we observe to what will happen next or what happened previously, right? Like the phase space of the particles in the box and bouncing around in the box, and which velocity which particle has and which position that it has. It might have a lot of numbers in it, but conceptually it's not a hard phase space to describe. It's six times n dimensional, and it looks like this, and we can even like talk about its geometry and all sorts of stuff. Like we're very good at describing phase spaces like that. But phase spaces that are more conditional and have hysteresis, we don't understand how to talk about. And Stuart Kauffman's example of this is like, um, when one molecule evolves and then another molecule evolves and then a new thing which combines them evolves, and now that can interact with a fourth thing over here. Like in theory, that was all predictable. Like we could have said like, what are all the chemicals that can possibly exist, like based on our knowledge of quantum field theory, and we could have predicted every possible, but that we actually can't do that. That seems to be way too hard. So instead, we work at the level of atoms, and we say, well, what atoms exist? Well, what can we make with those atoms? And we sort of start to list off various kinds of molecules that we might try to exist. And what we'll discover is almost none of them actually exist. Like nature never actually made any of these molecules at all, even though in theory it could have. But the fact
Interesting.
that it made this set of molecules, like you sort of imagine how many molecules have up to 100 atoms in them, right? And you could
Hmm.
just like, that's like whatever, however many, atoms are in the periodic table to the power of, 100, right? Like, or elements are in the, it's an astronomically large number that dwarfs the actual number of species of chemicals, let's say in ecology, that we see out there, right? Like not every possible carbohydrate that you could design in a lab actually exists in nature, and not every possible protein or amino acid you could think of like actually is used in real ecology, or in real metabolism. And so, but the reason for that is because of this phase space prediction problem, right? That like as soon as some things evolve, like the things that are way over here that are disconnected to the stuff that already evolved is not really helpful. We can't use it
Right.
anymore. So it doesn't matter that we theoretically could have built it. What matters is what we can actually build with what's the adjacent possible to what exists, right?
Hmm.
And that continuous like phenomenon of nature building on itself and what it just built in order to create the adjacent possible of what it can now build next is a really hard problem to think about, because if you approach it as a physicist and you just say, well, I just need to make a list of all possible molecules and I can figure out all possible chemical reactions between them,
Right.
and then I can figure out what will happen. Well, that doesn't work, because that's not how nature works. Nature doesn't look at that entire set and then decide here's the best pathway. It sort of evolves in a sort of drunken random walk, and then it just sort of like what happens happens, right? So similarly, if we're trying to say, well, what will be the AI ecology that solves the problem of mints or transaction volume or social media optimization of where data should be living in order to get it to people as fast as possible or whatever. We can sort of conjecture as we think it'll look this way, but what will actually happen will probably be
We have no
different, because
idea.
it'll be completely dependent on the sequence of things that evolved and like which order and how that all worked, right? Like the details are just very hard to predict because we don't understand how to reason about incredibly high dimensional like phase spaces like this.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, there are people with better intuition, and it comes kind of down a little bit to the taste of, like, to your point, the adjacent
Sure,
possible. Because this
sure.
is what happens in technology and startups. It's all about timing. What is that? Or, in intellectual ideas, right? Like there's a reason calculus
Hmm.
gets discovered at the same time by different people.
Yeah,
But
because it's
I
closer to a bunch of other stuff that we all already know about, so it's more likely to be
exactly.
in that next wave of adjacent possible discoveries or developments. Yeah, exactly. Right. So the real world is incredibly conditional, and that makes it really
Yeah.
hard to predict.
You've at least made the conjecture that maybe one of these AI life forms will be doing something like packet routing. Do you feel comfortable making any predictions on what some of these AIs will do first, or is that just a possibility and who knows how it actually goes?
I feel like again, the more discrete and coarse grained those predictions become, the more likely they are to be true, right? Like so,
Yeah.
like definitely, I think the reason packet routing is an interesting category is because it's so close to what the Lightning Network might be doing in the near future, right? Or even before it got to packet routing, probably just optimizing Lightning channels and knowing how much Bitcoin to park in a specific Lightning channel at a specific time of year, right? Like in order to be able to take advantage of whatever is about to happen, and understanding that and having observed that pattern and building it into your own planning. We already today write optimization software which does stuff like this. Anybody who knows anything about ad networks, for example, should be aware of like incredibly complicated and sophisticated the auction of which ad you will see when you hit a particular web property, like on a big ad network, really is. It's taking into account all sorts of information about you, the product, like the time of day, all this other stuff to try to get you to see something that you're going to click on. That's an
Yeah.
incredibly complex sale. So we're already good at optimizing these really like high dimensional spaces, but we're doing it, I think, in sometimes the dumbest ways. Like we're writing software to do it. We're having marketers like compare this campaign against that campaign very gradually over weeks and months as they learn to optimize a company's marketing flow. Like a real AI that was really good at that, like would be better at it in some level, but it's like we'll start with an AI that we programmed to be better at it with a lot of our own knowledge about how this stuff works. But as the world becomes more and more interconnected and more information is widely available to purchase, like through like Bitcoin, like it will start to do things and connect things that we might not have thought about. And at least if it's
Yeah.
any good, right? If it's
Yeah.
really good at its niche, right? If it's good at defending that niche, it will discover these things for us.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool. That's pretty exciting. So yeah, I sort of can say the closer we are to things that exist today, the more likely those things are to become, I don't know, AI life forms, or like kingdoms of AI life that we
I
interact
like
with,
it.
like the oceans or the heavens or whatever, the forest. Like we'll sort of understand um, the biomes, I guess, that get built, right? And I imagine there will probably be a biome, if you like, that's associated with the Lightning Network and routing payments and information at massive scale and making sure you've parked data and money exactly where it needs to be most optimally returning investment to you.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's definitely one thing. I think beyond that, it starts to get, I don't know, really interesting. I think there's a lot to be said for computations. and like which computations are occurring where, and like is that being done efficiently. I think there's, especially as we get to homomorphic encryption, so
Oh
that we
yeah.
can like, so like someone can do your computation for you without having to reveal your data. That's pretty cool. There's
I love
something in
that.
my mind about like a remore attaching itself to a shark, like in that picture, that I don't quite
Mm,
understand. um but yeah, it's just it's I think it's gonna be really cool to it's funny. It's like a vibe coding almost makes me think of this, right? Where like a bunch of people are conjecturing that like we don't actually have to program anymore. We just have to like use language to like vibe our way into what we wanted to program, which honestly does feel like programming on some level. Like the more intricate it becomes, the more it's actually just becoming programming again with a different language, right? Like just
right.
using human language as your computer programming language. So there's that element of it, but it's also like maybe the thing that we're programming is no longer the moving of bytes in between RAM and disk and CPU and registers. Maybe the thing that we're programming is now like how money moves around in these complex ecological market structures, right?
Yes.
For which it probably is more reasonable to speak in English than it is to speak in for loops. I don't know.
Mm, yeah,
So it's
I
there.
like it.
Who knows how that develops?
Okay, that is a perfect segue to the last question or prompt I'd like to suggest for you. When you talk about vibe coding at the application level, I'm going to suggest we end with what I'll perhaps say in a grandiose form is a service to humanity, which is vibe coding at the base model level. Now, as you've mentioned here today and in prior talks, like there have been so many people focused on the gray goo and the foam and just all this negativity. And I was with my buddy last weekend who was early at OpenAI, was one of the early ChatGPT paper authors. And, at first didn't care a whole lot about safety and was mentioning now that, he's having a kid. He's starting to think a lot more like, I don't want my kid to think dad accidentally like killed humanity, thinking a lot more about safety. And one of the points that came out of our conversation was I told him like that's fair and I think it's good to like, be reasonable and like there's always risks. But at the same time, I think if all we're doing is talking about all the bad outcomes, like we're going to manifest that whether we mean to or not. And then he made the great point. He's like, well, you mean that more sort of abstractly, but it's also true. Like if everything that we're putting out content in essays and potentially podcasts that get transcribed on the internet, this is what's going to train the next model right now, our conversation.
Yeah.
And I'm just like honestly very sick and tired of hearing just the Ecologies and like the crazy people talk about the end times. Um, I'm very encouraged by people like Kevin Kelly, who I like a lot, who's now working on a project of trying to paint an optimistic picture of what our world
Mhm.
could look like in 100 years with AI. So I'd like to maybe end with Dhruv. Could you, to the best of your ability, maybe give us, if you were speaking with the AI right now and saying, hey, here are some of the positive, futures I could imagine, or I would like to encourage you to explore, don't listen to those Zukowski people. Here's some good things you could be thinking about doing. What would you leave us with there?
I mean, I guess like the vibe, I often think about this too, of like, what would a cool science fiction story look like that
Yes.
reflected like my picture of what I think a ubiquitous AI digital ecology looks and feels like. Like, what is it like to live inside that world as a meat space entity? Um, and I think it's like it should feel something like walking through a forest. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Like it's quiet and you hear birds and you hear like you're just surrounded by life and you don't
yeah.
understand all of it or like the purpose of any of it, but it's like sort of beautiful. And I think there we've co-evolved with that life. Like we came up through the same biomes and ecologies that life was. We're part of that ecosystem ultimately. We're not part of the digital ecosystem the same way. Like in some sense, we created it, and we have to sort of allow it to grow, but they don't connect back to our world, right? Because ultimately, these things have to communicate with our world because that's how they create value. That's how they earn their Bitcoin. That's how they keep living and having their thoughts and their feelings. But if there was a way to walk through a digital space, right, and or something, or maybe it's more physicalized than that. Maybe your walk down the street feels like you're in a forest because you're surrounded not by loud klaxons advertising to you or anything like that in an attention sort of sucking way, but just because it's just full of life. You know what I mean? And like the traffic light itself is like living, it's a living creature now, right? And like we no longer build things by like an industrial factory based process of monocultures where everything is exactly the same and it's built to be exactly the same. But in some sense, we're growing these things, right? Like maybe not their physical bodies. We might have to still wire and weld a tube, but we don't like program it and flash it with a fixed piece of software. We just sort of like leave it. We just
Yeah.
drop it onto the corner, and we trust that, like I don't know, like a starter culture, you know, 1,000 years ago, it would just absorb the right germs from the environment around it. That like, if you leave an empty niche inside of, you know, a traffic light that you've just installed, and it sits there on the corner, like within a couple hours, it'll start behaving like a traffic light because
Yeah.
something will colonize it because the world is a living place. And that feels like closer to the picture that I have of like what really powerful, ubiquitous AI feels like. It doesn't feel like, you know, oppressors who control everything around us. Like it feels like viriditas, right? Like the force for life to propel itself through the
Mm.
cosmos. But like now, just everything is alive. You know, this computer is a living thing. This is my horse now, right? You know what I mean? Like,
A friend. He's my friend.
yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, in some ways that evokes for me somewhat of more of like a solar punk aesthetic, or at least that's something I kind of hope we get to. You know, I'm recording out of the Presidio. I kind of hope the world looks a lot more like the Presidio. There's trees, there's sunshine,
Mhm.
there are computers. You know, I always think back to the Kevin Kelly book, Out of Control. Man, that guy was so good so early on. And one of my big takeaways from that book was that over time, uh, physical biological life learns from technology, and technology learns from physical biological life, and eventually the two just we all fuse because they're it's kind of a
It's an
yes it's real but it's
artificial distinction. Yeah.
exactly it's an artificial distinction. So that's where I hope we end up. So AI, if you're listening to this, let's be friends, let's build a solar punk awesome world. Beautiful. Drew,
Thank
anything else you want to add, man, to cap us off, or any final send offs, crazy ideas, mundane ideas, whatever you want?
Maybe we'll just leave with another word that I think Kevin Kelly first coined, which is protopian, right?
Ooh,
It's not
yes.
utopian because utopian is coded for like naive and can't possibly exist. And it's not dystopian. Dystopian is so fashionable right now, right? Like the Black Mirror take on everything, like the Black
Yeah.
Pill. Like protopian is something else, right? It's like there is a pathway for this to be beautiful and to be natural in all the best connotations of that word, though perhaps still a little bit red in tooth and claw at times, right? Because nature can be fucking metal. But there's, I don't know, I like that vision for the world, and I'm looking forward to what Kevin Kelly has to say on this topic too, because I don't know, that's the world that I want to be part of. That's I think the world that Bitcoin is building towards. It's not a
Yeah.
utopia, right?
Yeah.
It's which I think literally means no place, right? It's
Yeah.
not an impossible place to exist. It's a place that we can actually get to that we can build towards. So protopia.
I love it. Beautiful way to end. Drew, as I expected, this was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, my friend. And hopefully we get to do this again in the not too distant
Yeah,
future.
yeah. Thank you, Max.